Everybody ready? We're going to go ahead and call to order our City Council study session of May 19th. And we only have one issue on before us, which is ballot items. And I'm going to turn it over to City Manager Jane Brodigan.
Thank you, Mayor. So one thing I'll note is that everyone has their own microphone. All of the batteries are new. And we have 2 new routers in the ceiling. And one of the things that we learned as we were fixing things is that we only had 1 router before and it was misplaced. So that's one of the things that was making it harder. So yeah, we think we've started to fix a few issues. But anyway, so hopefully everyone can hear us tonight. Yeah. Yeah. No, we have to go on. So tonight we do have pretty much a single item, but with 4 different parts to it. This is going to be starting to consider potential ballot measures that the council might wish to put on the ballot for November. And we have this meeting every year, usually at the end of April or beginning of May, so that you can give the staff direction on which of the items that we've been thinking about that you want us to actually work on in the next several months in preparation for the council voting to actually put something on the ballot. So tonight is the first opportunity for you to take things off the table or add things onto the table. And we've got 4 items tonight. The first will be municipalization, and Tom Carr will present that item. Then we'll be talking about the renewal of the 0.3% capital sales and use tax. I'll be presenting that and also giving an update on the work of the Community Advisory Committee. Then we have a broadband presentation, and Carl Castile will be making that presentation. And then finally, your charter subcommittee has been working on looking at the charter to see if there are items that we might change or add to the charter, and Tom will be making that presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom right now to talk about municipalization ballot measures.
Good evening. As you all know, there are several things that are coming to a head right now, and we're sort of dealing with a moving target to some extent because we're in the middle of litigation and there's things going forward. But there are some things that you might want to consider for the ballot this year, and I'll talk about them. I've grouped them generally into 4 categories. 1, renewal and extension of the current utility occupation tax. 2, additional funding for short-term and long-term needs. Renewal and extension of executive sessions. Amendment of Charter Section 178A, and consideration of a ballot measure deleting Charter Section 189, which allowed for a choice for out-of-city electric customers. I'm going to go through each one of these individually. You don't have to remember what I just said. The utility occupation tax, as you all know, was originally passed in 2010, and the original portion of the utility occupation tax was to replace the franchise fee that we were no longer getting after the council decided not to renew the franchise in August of 2010. In 2011, the utility occupation tax was amended to add additional taxation to pay for the cost of exploring municipalization, and that generates about $2.1 million a year. In 2015, the voters extended the portion of the tax that pays for that is actually replaces the franchise fee. That has been extended to 2022. And that's not before you tonight. The portion of the tax that pays for the funding of the municipalization effort, that $2.1 million, expires on December 31st of this year. So one of the questions that we have for council is whether or not to extend that. We supplement that with a budget item of about $375,000 from the general fund that goes to pay ongoing costs, although not all of that is spent or has been spent this year. So one of the things we'd ask is the council consider increasing the tax slightly to pay so that the general fund isn't paying for this. We don't recommend, there's of course other support for the municipalization project above and beyond that. For example, my salary, Jane's salary, we spend a portion of our time doing this. That's not allocated in this at all. So in addition, we have some additional immediate and future needs that I wanted to discuss with council and at least put it on your in your minds as we go forward. We have a study session scheduled for July 11th of this year where we intend to flesh these out some more. But I wanted to give you a first look at these, and some of them may require council consideration of a ballot measure this year. So one thing, we've got the $2.1 million, and that's pretty much meeting our ongoing expenses. We have some extraordinary expenses that will be beyond that, which will not be covered by that. One of those is trial costs. We have a trial coming up in the PUC. The trial costs will push our expenses above and beyond what we can pay out of the utility occupation tax. In addition, if things go well at the PUC, we expect to be in condemnation court next year. And again, that will push our expenses above and beyond. One of the issues currently before the PUC is the question whether the city should have to do detailed engineering design before the PUC approves the separation plan. And right now, we've done what I believe is a very detailed design for the engineering separation. However, the other parties have pushed and want us to do the kind of plans that you can hand to someone to actually start construction the next day, although a lot of our stuff is at the level where people would normally have to bid out a project. Nevertheless, there is a push to have us do that. Our estimate is that the detailed design engineering costs would be about 6% of the total cost of separation. Now, I say 6%, that's our estimate based on what we've done. Our public works folks who do this all the time say that it could be higher, it could be 10 to 15%. So we're talking about separation costs of about $73 million. 6% of that's about $4 million. 10% is, of course, about $7 million. So again, that wouldn't be, the current utility occupation tax wouldn't be sufficient to cover that. And if the PUC orders us to do that detailed design before approving the separation, it's something that we're going to have to figure out how to fund. Bob, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a timing question on that detailed design. If we do have to do that, when would that come into play?
It's not clear. It depends on what the order would be. The question, we would prefer to push the detailed design to after the go, no-go decision, which we're tentatively saying would be in mid-2019. The hit would be if the commission says, no, you have to do that before we make a decision, and we'd have to spend those dollars in 2018. The other wild card out there is a FERC proceeding. Right now, we're not estimating a lot of costs for FERC proceeding. Our current proposal has very little transmission level work. It's just basically connecting the transformers at the substations to the Xcel's transmission system. So we haven't estimated a large cost for that. If we got hit with a stranded cost case, however, a full-blown stranded cost case would be very expensive, and we'd have to think about ways to fund that. And then so on the bottom, I have future needs. These are not things that we would expect to occur after the council came back and had to make the go, no-go decision in mid-2019. And those are transition costs and separation costs. And when I say transition costs, what I mean is the cost of standing up a utility. Now, we have had some conversations with some private companies who are willing to front the costs of that in return for a longer-term contract after. Separation costs, of course, are the costs of building the actual separation, what we're estimating at $73 million. There's some question about when the city would have to pay for that. Our current view is that we've been pushed to a point where we're pushing the construction to after the condemnation, but before the turnover. So the Xcel would do all the, under our current proposal, the proposal that's going in tomorrow, Xcel would do all of the construction on its own system. So it's our view that if Xcel's building stuff on its own system, it should pay for it, and we should reimburse them when we acquire the system, when it becomes ours. Xcel, of course, takes a contrary view. So there may be, if the commission says we have to pay as we go, as they build, then there would be a requirement to fund that $73 million or so as an ongoing basis as Xcel did the construction. Now, our current projection is that would not be until after mid-2019. So the current proposal is for us to go through condemnation, figure out what the cost of acquisition is going to be, and then have council make a go, no-go decision once you know what it's going to cost, and then we might have to fund the transition costs and the separation costs. So I'm going to move on to executive sessions. The provision allowing for executive sessions, as you know, the charter requires that all council meetings be public, and the interpretation has been that that prohibits executive sessions. The voters have voted down executive sessions several times, so it's a pretty strong interpretation. Our current the voters allowed for executive sessions for limited to municipalization, legal strategy, and negotiation strategy. That authority expires on December 31st of this year. So one of the things I would like council to consider is whether or not the ability to have those sessions should continue. We've had some feedback from at least one member of the community that the negotiation strategy thing needs to be tweaked some. We've gotten some complaints about the fact that we negotiated without involving the public. That's a question for council about whether or not you want to change that. I've put the language up in really small type to make it impossible for you to read, but that's the full language of the section. And as you can see, it has, since you've all done it, you're familiar with the constraints, but it prohibits, it requires 2/3 vote to go into executive session. It prohibits any decision in executive session, and it has that limited scope for executive session. So one of the things I'd like you to consider is whether or not to extend this, and if so, whether you want to modify it.
And Tom, can you, and if you don't, I'm happy to do it, but Claire, what I think the same individual you're referring to that's raised questions has made the allegation that XL and/or their attorneys actually participated in the executive sessions, and that's false, right?
Oh, absolutely false. No.
Thank you.
The only people ever at executive sessions were city staff and council members. Yes, Jan?
Since I wasn't here when you discussed this last time, my question would be, if we did not have executive sessions, what would be the alternative? Would be to have the discussion in a full council meeting, or do you have to have the conversation with two members at a time?
So we do both. So as you know, I do a lot of confidential memos, so it's in writing, and then we do the 2x2 meetings, and we did those before we had executive session. Of course, the challenge with that is that I can't tell one group what another group said. So you can't really have any discussion. And it could be that you were in one group and Aaron was in a different one, and Aaron said something that really responded to something, your concerns. But if I told you what he said, then it would be a serial meeting, and that would violate state law. I would take the position that it would violate. So we don't do that. So we listen and talk, but there's no ability to interchange, which you have in the executive sessions. My own personal belief is I believe they're a very valuable tool for council. And then, so there are a couple of other charter changes. Section 178 of the charter, as you all know, provides for certain metrics to be met. In 2013, council went through the process of meeting those metrics. Now, all that does is allow for the creation of a municipal electric utility. So just creating the entity. It doesn't authorize operation. Authorizations are covered by a separate section of the charter. We have been tied up in litigation over this decision for 3 years now. And maybe it's 4, almost 4. I see no end in sight, although right now we're at the stage where we've petitioned for certiorari for review by the Supreme Court of the state of Colorado. If they deny the petition, that litigation's done, for at least that litigation. But where we were from a procedural posture is that the court said that the decision wasn't final, and that another decision would have to be made, which would again be subject to challenge. This is important because bonding agencies want to know that the entity that you're bonding exists. And this is a challenge to the existence of the utility itself, the body that we created. So it puts a cloud on that. I would like council to consider amending Section 178, either to take the provisions out or to modify them in a way that they would be more immune to challenge. And then the last thing is we took a look, I'm sorry, Aaron.
Can I ask a question about that, Tom, while
Sure.
we're talking about it? Can you be a little bit more specific about what that language might look like? What would we be amending or taking out specifically?
So one option that I would like is that the charter metrics require that the council make a finding that those could be met and have that verified by a third party, an independent third party. Council did all of that. It was verified, and they approved it by ordinance. We could amend to say that the council has found that these have been met. That would be one simple thing. You could amend it in a way that didn't make it so much of a quasi-judicial approach, where what council had to do was take a set of criteria and apply metrics to them, and make it more of a legislative action to make it more immune to challenge, or you could just take them out.
Can you talk about the timing on this one? I understand it's currently in litigation, but the pros and cons of doing it now or doing it later?
Well, the sooner we can take the cloud off the head of the utility, the better it is for bonding purposes, although we're probably not going to be bonding for several years, probably until, right now it's looking like between 2019 and 2022. So you could do this at a later time. We still will have the litigation, depending on what the Supreme Court does with the petition that we filed.
Even if we pass this, we still have the litigation.
Now, if you pass this, we could argue that the litigation is moot.
So, Tom, I guess one of the criticisms of us going down this path is that members of the public would say, the only reason you're doing that is because if you had to go back today and make that determination, rightly or wrongly, they would allege that we couldn't no longer meet the metrics because of the cost or whatnot. And so are we better off addressing this issue once we know what the cost is, and perhaps at that point in time, the voters have approved a different amount of money? And that way you sort of remove that. In other words, if we don't need to do this until bonding, what's the rush, especially if it sort of exposes the city to an argument that it's trying to sort of slip something by?
Well, the reason to do it earlier rather than later is to get the metrics met and have any challenge proceed before we have to get to bonding. So if you change them and you met them and we got sued, probably 3 years of litigation are going to ensue. And I would like to get the litigation over before we have to face bonding or issue debt for the utility.
But just to follow up, if we were to, in essence, redo our charter requirements because of funding issues, then there's a whole new, and in doing that, then, with the approval of that, we sort of say, and by fiat, where we've met the requirements, then we sort of eliminate that political issue of the argument that we're trying to do something based on a decision made years ago that some people say we couldn't do now. And so I guess, is there a downside to doing it the way I described, which is if we're going to redo the charter metrics at all, doing it at that point in time?
The downside is the delay and the risk of that. Even no matter what you do, Xcel will file a lawsuit.
But again, just to be clear, but couldn't we, at the time that we knew the cost, do what you're saying right there, which is perhaps next year, and say, hey, at this point in time, we're done, and we eliminate that requirement, and the voters can't say, we're trying to hide something because everybody knows the cost?
Yep. Yes.
So wait a minute. No, I was following till that last piece. I mean, your problem, Tom, I assume, is when you want to go do the bonding, but you don't want to go do the bonding until after condemnation.
Yeah.
Now, there's still this whole separation stuff, but presumably you'd have to do something after condemnation. We don't really know the timing of all of that. But if you want to be certain, and you can never be totally certain, but if you want to be more or less certain, you have to wait till all the costs are known. You don't know what all the costs are until after the PC rules, after condemnation, after FERC does whatever FERC is or isn't going to do, as the case may be. And after you really get a bill for all the separation, which Xcel is doing, so the bill will no doubt rise over time. And so you don't really know the cost, which would mean you would be not able to, at least if I'm hearing you right, Andrew, you wouldn't be able to determine if you've met the requirement until kind of the very last minute. And then the problem is Excel can sue, and you have to sit and twiddle your thumbs for 3 years while it works its way through the courts. Is that correct?
Well, I think what I'm saying here is Tom's proposed a method that would eliminate litigation as an option for Excel. And so the question is, granted, we won't know to the dollars and cents, but we'll have a sense of order of magnitude. Presumably as we're getting close to, at a minimum, by the time we get a condemnation ruling, the time of the no decision, for example, we'll certainly know because we have to go, right? And so around that time, whether it's the year before or we'll know how we've done at the PUC, we'll know some other facts. Then we can essentially eliminate the litigation option for Excel without the public saying, oh, you're just doing that because you can't meet your metrics.
Yeah, I kind of get that. If you can really eliminate the litigation option, that certainly gives you a little more flexibility. I mean, I got to say that, and I don't have super strong feelings about this, but as I've thought about this, the requirement that we have, yeah, it talks about reliability and stuff. Obviously, first of all, the PUC is going to demand that in the end. But the working piece that most people look at is that you have to have competitive rates or comparable rates on day one, which is frankly a weird metric. It's always been kind of a weird metric, and since I was on council when we put it in, I'll take part of the blame for that. It doesn't really say a lot because that's day one. I think what any council would be interested in would not be only day one. It would be, I think the better metric we've seen, which maybe is a little harder to explain to people, which is the net present value calculation. In other words, in the longer run, is this a good thing to do or not? And the hard part with that calculation, of course, is by definition, you're making estimations of future energy costs. How else can you make that type of judgment, right? I mean, you're looking at your energy costs and you're looking at Excel's energy costs. Nobody knows that definitively. But that's still, to me, a much better way to look at it, is to say, well, council's going to look at whether this actually makes sense for the city over time, which is kind of the net present value metric. And it's not that it has to be exact, but you'd kind of prefer it not be negative 200 million, that's for sure. Which the buyout option that Excel gave us, that was hundreds of million negative. So you look at that and say, well, okay, that's not a great deal. I mean, all of us looked at that and said, that's not a great deal. Okay, that's a pretty good metric then. We weren't worried about day one costs. We were worried about the long-term costs. I don't know how you word that, but it just has struck me that seems like a better approach. And no, we don't want litigation, not because some council is going to cheat, but because it just opens up this avenue for Excel to, as they will always do, delay it for 3. They don't really care if they're going to win or not. It doesn't matter to them whether they win. They just delay it for 3 years. And that's a victory. So you don't really want to open that door. So
What are you proposing?
So I would like something that I guess is legislative in nature, that can't theoretically be litigated, but where we would in fact replace the current requirement, which I don't think works very well. And also I think the litigation that it's currently subject to is, time potentially could be pretty time consuming for no great outcome.
But we can't change the charter legislatively.
No, but this is a charter change.
But you mean to put it on the ballot?
Yeah. And amend section 178, but put some wording in that I think is a little bit more apropos about what the then council would consider in terms of, do you proceed or do you not proceed? And for me, it's really that net present value calculation. But the charter would have to be darn clear that this isn't an exact calculation. It's kind of the best, based on best estimates. Because what else can you do? Look, that's why originally we said day one, because I remember all these conversations. We said day one, even though I think several of us weren't thrilled with it, because how could you guarantee that on day 647, the rates would be comparable? Well, you can't. I mean, you could have blips up and down. One year it could be a little higher, one year it could be a little lower. You don't know because you don't know energy costs. But a net present value calculation kind of smooths that out, averages it out over time. That's a little bit more rational, to me at least.
So just to ask a process question, should we have the discussion about how to proceed with this now, or we can move on and come back?
I have a question slide in 2 slides.
We will hold.
Okay. So this is one of the 2 slides. So the last thing I wanted to raise is the question of the Section 189. Back when the city's original plan was to have 9 interconnection points and serve the area outside the city. That plan has been disregarded or the PUC says we can't do it. So we're no longer planning to serve out-of-city customers. Section 189 was put in the charter to allow for out-of-city customers to have a choice of the city or Excel. It would be the first community choice aggregation provision in the state of Colorado. It's not necessary anymore, so you could consider deleting it. It doesn't hurt to have it in the charter because it doesn't affect anybody since we won't be serving them, but we could also take it out. There was a question about the governing board. There is a provision that allows out-of-city individuals to serve on the governing board, but it doesn't require them, and I recommend that it stay because it allows for businesses who might want a representative who doesn't live in the city, but whose business serves the city, to serve on the advisory board or the governing board. So these are my questions. I did want to add one thing about the tax. One thing I'd like you to consider, when the funding for municipalization portion of the utility occupation tax was passed, it was passed for 5 years. And that gave Excel a target. As a lawyer, if you tell me all I have to do is delay for 5 years, that's a whole lot easier than telling me I have to win. And so I would ask, as you think about this, to think about what the appropriate time, if you decide to extend the tax, would be. As your lawyer, I would prefer it to be forever so that they have nothing to shoot at. I know that might not be, as a policy matter, somewhere you want to go, but I would ask you to think about it in that context. So these are the 5 questions that we have. As you can see, you can read them. They relate to the 5 subjects that I've just discussed.
And so let's clarify. The question before us is whether we want to direct staff to prepare them as options. We're not saying that we'd want to adopt them, but whether we want to have them on the menu and go ahead and get them as time allows for them to prepare them, even though we wouldn't be choosing till after much later in the summer. So we don't have to agonize over whether we support them. It's whether we want to be able to have them around. So on that note, I think we can go through some of these pretty quickly. Right? Number 1, does anybody, what?
I have a few more questions.
Oh, you have questions. Okay, go ahead. We'll do questions.
Aaron, do you want to go?
No. I was giving you a thumbs up.
Okay. Well, I just have a question on number 2. If we did not go forward with number 2, what do we think that the amounts that we might need in, say, 17 and 18 would be? I know they're dependent on certain outcomes, but let's say the PUC gives us a path forward. What do we need to incur in the near term, so in 18 and 19, in order to meet that?
So, Sam, I do not have an answer for you about that yet. That's what we're going to discuss on July 11th. Our team is working on firming up those numbers, and I don't really want to put a number out there yet until they've done their work on that.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we go through them one at a time? If people have questions, we'll ask them at the time. Does anybody disagree with having an option for extending the utility occupation tax, have staff prepare that? In other words, do we support having staff prepare that? Okay. And I think we can decide dates later. Yeah? Okay. Good enough? Okay, number 2, additional funding. I guess I have a question, which is, well, just that since we don't know the number, if it's appropriate to if we said, go ahead and prepare something that we don't know the number for,
So I think what my preference would be is just, let's leave that on the table for July 11th. Unless council members feel strongly that we shouldn't consider it at all, then we would cancel the July 11th study session. But if you're okay with us at least proceeding that, we won't actually prepare a ballot measure, but we will bring forward all the information July 11th. And on that date, you could give us direction on whether or not to bring forward a ballot measure. And there's still time then to get it on the ballot if we need to.
So I'm unclear why we would cancel the study session if we decide we wouldn't be doing a ballot. Wouldn't we still want to get the update and learn more about what the next steps are?
Yes, I would guess that's true.
okay, so we'll still have a study session, yeah?
I realize that we don't know the amounts, Tom, and we may not know on July 11th, but with respect to number 2, this could either be an increase in the utility occupation tax, or it could be a completely separate ballot measure. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Wait, this is an either or, 1 or 2?
No. No.
It could be both. I just wanted to understand whether two is possibly a standalone ballot measure, or it could be just an increase in the utility occupation tax. And I think Tom said it could be either one. We'll talk about that in July.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing I'd like to know, just a little bit of financial analysis, I suppose, is the way you put it, depends how things turn out, but there could be some fairly near-term expenses for the PUC hearing and then condemnation. But then later on down the line, maybe some of those expenses go away. So if you, for instance, if you ask people, hey, you willing to re-up the utility occupation tax for 6 years, the question is, well, if that actually raises enough money, but it's just kind of the timing is wrong, is there something you can do about that?
We could bond against it if we had.
Well, bonding or borrowing from the city and repaying the city or something. I mean, I hate to, it's not so much I'm worried about losing the issue. It's really just a practical matter of, I hate to bump up the tax when really the total amount you're going to collect would be enough. It's just that the ebb and flow of when you need it doesn't exactly match the ebb and flow of when you get it. And the question is, can our finance people kind of smooth that out and make it work?
Bob is nodding his head yes. But very.
If Bob is nodding yes, then that's all I need to know.
Okay, so you had more to say on this one?
Yeah, well, just that I wouldn't want to try to fund this year long-term needs, but I'm certainly open to learning more about where we are in July and thinking about short-term needs. So I'm happy with leaving this open, but just I'll say I don't think this is the year to pass things to fund us through 2022 or something. So
I'm sort of inclined that direction as well, but yeah, let's talk in July. Folks, okay. Okay, executive sessions. Okay, I'll just say they have been very helpful, and we have followed the rules. So unless we find out something that leads us to think we are no longer going to be litigating, I would recommend having that option. Yes.
I agree, and I just wanted to see one small thing added that specifies that there will be no teleconferencing in on these meetings.
So I also support going forward with them. They've been extremely helpful to me as well. And I would be open to discussing whether there are any further restrictions that we want to have. I don't have a strongly formed opinion about that, but I think it is something that some members of the community will bring forward, so we should be willing to learn and talk with them.
Matt?
Yeah, I'm not going to be here, and I don't really trust the rest of you, so I don't know what I feel about this. There's no question it was helpful. I mean, Tom is absolutely right. I've been through enough other issues where you do the 2-on-2, and it's kind of crazy making because you can't hear from each other, and that makes it really difficult. I mean, you always feel like, boy, I'm missing some really good questions, and I can't find out what they are, and Tom can't tell me because that would be cheating. So I never will know what those good questions were, unfortunately, which is a little bizarre. You try to make a decision, you don't even know what the good questions were that your colleagues asked. So I would certainly like us to look at it. I think the thing that maybe annoyed people the most was the negotiations with Excel as opposed to the legal strategy. And I'll just say two things about that real quickly. First of all, I think it was essential we had it at the time, because I don't think we would have had any negotiations with Excel if we hadn't had the executive sessions, because
But just to be clarified, we did not negotiate with Excel in executive session.
No, we
That
didn't.
needs to be said.
We didn't, but we talked about strategy, which is what we're allowed to do. And that would have been really hard to do 2-on-2, because that really would have been a place where I would have been thinking, well, what does Sam think? What does Aaron think? I'm never going to know what they think. And I think that was really important, frankly, because we got Excel to give us offers that were really bad. And I think that was actually extremely helpful in the grand scheme of things. However, I don't know that that approach makes any sense moving forward. I think that's just very unlikely that there'll be more of that moving. It's not impossible. It just seems highly unlikely. So if you're going to look at anything, I guess I would look at that. Legal strategy, of course. I mean, legal strategy is legal strategy. That means working with the PUC. It means during condemnation hearings. It's all the stuff that is kind of really, if there are choices, what type of choices do you make? How do you pursue it? And I think the council should have a role in that. And even though I would dearly love that to be out in the public, it's a little tricky when you're creating strategy and you're going into some court or the PUC and you just had this public conversation about it. That's very difficult. So I'd look at it, but there could be some changes that might help it.
Well, I want to re-emphasize there were no negotiations in the executive sessions. It is absolutely impossible to separate legal strategy from negotiation strategy. They are one and the same. And so that line drawing would be a nightmare. And I don't think anyone would want, rule number one for a young trial lawyer is you never, ever foreclose the possibility that you might engage in a negotiation, or that you might, or that your litigation strategy might be to drive the other side to negotiate with you. And so if what you're saying is that A, that we could sort that out, or B, that we should say that it is absolutely impossible that we could ever reach an off-ramp with Excel, I think that's irresponsible. But that's just, yeah.
Aaron?
I didn't say it was not possible. It was a question about whether you discuss it in executive session. And I don't ever preclude anything, but you did say one thing as a young lawyer here, that is relevant, and it may make it hard to word it, and that is, yeah, defining terms here is tough. Just one example popped into my mind as you were speaking, which is even if, for instance, the city is not going to be, quote, negotiating, and no negotiation doesn't happen at the meetings, but strategy, talking about it, was happening at the meetings. Even if you're not going to negotiate with Excel about some alternative to municipalization, doesn't mean you wouldn't, and this is where you're absolutely right, potentially negotiate with Excel about some points that are at issue before the PUC or before the condemnation court, where the two sides might amazingly agree on something. After all, it's happened before. You could call that legal strategy, you could call that negotiation. That's kind of a fine line as to what to call it.
I think that's his point.
One other comment, just as we talk through, is if we create it so that discussion, even any discussions of potential resolution, have to be can only be talked about amongst council members with their counsel in open sessions, which we don't want, because also judges then see what your discussions are about settlement. And all of a sudden you create a situation where Excel would have a legal advantage against us by making an offer and trying to make us look unreasonable as we have these open discussions. You'd rather want to be able to have that conversation with your lawyer in private and remove the sort of the politicization of the legal issues into a private session. Now, granted, we could do about 2x2s, but again, we're getting back to where we were before. So,
Aaron.
So I certainly understand how useful the executive sessions have been in this process. I have to say that I found it very challenging to exercise my role as an elected official without being able to talk to members of the community about something that so many people care so much about. We had a long time where we had to maintain radio silence, and you want to get feedback from people. You want to talk to your constituents and hear their thoughts. So I found that challenging. I'm willing to move executive sessions on to the next step here, but if we do put them on the ballot and they get passed, I'd really like to have a good discussion about how we might blend talking in public with talking in executive session on these matters in next year and going forward.
A couple of council members have pointed out that we did not negotiate with Excel or any of the representatives during executive session. It was just council members and staff. That's all it was. I want to point out that one of the reasons that I was comfortable with us discussing strategy around the discussions that occurred with Excel was because we insisted on preserving a city utility as part of this. And so the whole point of executive sessions was to discuss legal strategy, negotiation strategy around the formation of a city utility. And so that was something that remained key, I think, to council, and I think it's key to the community. And so just as we're kind of discussing it here, that would be something that I would think we would absolutely want to carry forward. The only kinds of discussions that we could have in executive session would be around a municipal electric utility of some form.
Okay, so maybe to sum up where I think we are, well, I'll just give my opinion, which is I found them very helpful. I also agree with what Aaron said, which was it was hard to not be engaging with the public during that time. As we do go forward, it may be useful to think about ways to engage folks on certain aspects of the issue that we have to chew on that maybe don't need to be confidential. So I would also support that. Okay, but for now, go ahead and include that. And of course, the public is more than, we'll be happy to entertain amendments to that if that needs to happen. But yeah, meanwhile, we'll go ahead and have staff prepare. It's already prepared, but anyhow, okay. Number 4. Third-party verification. Do people want to take that on this year, or I am not inclined? Or what other people think?
I like Andrew's points about tackling it another year with maybe more certainty and more numbers.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I'm getting worried about putting too many things on the ballot along these lines. But I do wonder about the court case a little bit. I mean, well, Tom, I mean, speak to where that might go and what it might cost us to defend a court case that might turn out to be totally irrelevant.
Well, right now, as I said, we've got a petition for certiorari. We've been doing most of the work on this case in-house, although we did use some outside expertise to help draft this Supreme Court petition, and we might. So all that's left right now would be briefing an argument in the Supreme Court, so not a huge expense. If the Supreme Court were to reverse and send it back to the district court for some reason, that could add additional expenses. If the Supreme Court denies cert, then we have to redo the certification. Or go to the voters to change it.
can I ask, we could, whatever happens at the Supreme Court, whether they deny cert and we go back or it's remanded, presumably we could, or let me ask you, we could effectively, could we stay the litigation to save money pending a ballot measure on the subject? I mean,
Well, you know, Andrew, that's up to the court whether they grant such a stay.
right. A lot of judges don't like to reach decisions if something's going to be mooted.
Yep.
Yeah. So
So and remember, the district court ruled in our favor and dismissed the litigation. And it was the Court of Appeals that decided that they could change that and say that it wasn't ripe without giving us a chance to discuss it. So that's what's before the Supreme Court. There's a chance the Supreme Court will take cert, which, as you know, it's a long shot anytime you're petitioning for cert. They just don't take very many cases. And they could reinstate the district court's decision, which I believe was correctly decided.
So in which case, if they did grant us cert, there'd be a briefing, and that could be the end of it.
Yes.
Okay. Sam?
Yeah,
and
I'm
then Bob.
inclined to wait on this one as well.
Bob?
I ultimately may be fine to wait on this as well, too, but I mean, remember tonight, we're only deciding whether we have staff present us options. And Matt made what I thought were some pretty persuasive points. And I'd like to at least keep the option open until July and hear what staff comes up with, because it sounds like it's not fully baked yet. Sounds like there's 3 or 4 different ways we could do this. We may decide that none of them make sense, either because the ballot's already overloaded or because we don't like any of the choices or we want to wait to see what the court does. But I think Matt made some good points about at least keeping our options open. And I guess I'd kind of like to see in July what our options might be. We may kick those down the road until 2018 or 2019. I get that. But if it's not a whole lot of work, I guess I kind of like to see those. That's where I'm at.
Kyle, agree. Is that something that you're intending to bring back in July as well? Because I understood that we were going to be talking about the number 2, right? Additional funding needs that may come. Is it also going to involve?
Well, the way we normally do ballot measures, as you know, Sam, is we bring first reading ordinances to council. So and on many occasions, we've brought multiple versions of a first reading ordinance. We don't really have time to do before the break. So when we talk about July, we're really talking about bringing back first reading ordinances sometime after the break in July. We might want to talk about it depending on where we are at the July 11th study session to get further guidance, because the first council meeting isn't until after that. So we could do that, or we could do what we normally do, which is just bring you back things and you could decide which way you might want to go.
Can I ask a follow-up? So one of the things, or several of the things that were talked about with respect to this item 4, one was sort of effectively a ballot item that says we're done. We don't have to meet it, or we've met it. One of the something like that. The other thing that Matt talked about was the idea of actually altering the metrics, like, for example, taking rate parity out. Is that what you're talking about, somebody drafting up as well?
Yeah, it could be any number of things. I think Tom had a couple of other options as well. I guess it sounds like we have a handful of options and they're not fully baked, and I guess I'd kind of be curious as to what those are. It's work that's going to eventually have to be done anyway, so we either do the work now or we do the work next year. And we do the work now and we decide we don't like any of them, we want to wait. It seems to me we just put it on the shelf and we're ready for next year.
How much work is this? Because it does think if we get far-reaching, it could.
It's not something we do in a few hours, but it's something we're used to doing, and it's something we've kind of got budgeted. We expect June and July to be drafting ballot measures, so it's something we're ready and prepared to do. So if council wants to consider something, we're happy to do it, and it's not going to delay any other work items on our agenda.
Okay. I guess I doubt that I will want to go forward, so I guess it's not a high priority for me. So, but if I'm curious at the depth of our curiosity on this one. So I guess it's not a top priority if you run out of time for me. Go ahead, Mary.
I'm kind of with Suzanne. I just don't see the point of drafting things if we're unlikely to go with them. It just seems like not the best use of time.
Well, I'll make one more shot at this. I actually think it would be helpful, and I think voters might feel like the metric is more relevant than what was previously there. Because again, the previous metric, which was the day one, a lot of people had some concern over that about, well, yes, day one's nice, but doesn't tell you much. And it doesn't really tell you much. Again, we put it in because that was the only thing we thought we could really measure with any certainty. But I think something that changes that and is a little more comprehensive, like a net present value, I mean, frankly, I think that could give some people a little more confidence that council isn't going to go ahead with this unless it makes sense, makes monetary sense.
But then how would you address the court's decision, which is you haven't met it yet? Would you
Well, no,
talk
that's
about
that
third-party
was
recertify it? Or-
that was Tom's thing about make it a legislative decision that is not, you can't really be sued over. And no, you wouldn't do it until after condemnation, when you had essentially all or most of the costs.
So are proposing to come up with new charter criteria, and that we just decide at that time?
Yep, but at least
Don't
it'd
need
be.
third-party certification?
Yeah, I think so, because frankly, you're going to know. I mean, a lot of the third-party certification the last time around was because we didn't really know. There were lots of moving parts, let's face it, which is why they did all of these, statistical and probabilistic analysis. When you get after condemnation, I mean, the only thing you don't know for certain is really energy costs, but the net present value, as the ones we saw, whatever that was, a couple of months ago, you're making some assumptions about your energy costs. You're making some assumptions about Excel's energy costs. As long as you're using the same basis for the assumptions, if they both are a little high or both are a little low, all you care about is the relative nature of them. And I think you can get a pretty good shot at it. And so you don't necessarily, your world, your probabilistic world is really compressed.
So just talk to us about what you're proposing.
Well, Matt, let me just say that I agree with your abstract point about those being better metrics. I just feel like this is not the year for it. So I wouldn't want to tackle that on a ballot issue this year. So not to disagree with the points you were just making, but for me, it's a timing question about this year.
And I get that, and I don't actually disagree with it. I'm just kind of thinking aloud, I suppose, about whether, in fact, people in the community who are thinking about municipalization or not might actually not be assured a little bit by having that metric in there and saying, okay, now we get what the decision is going to be based on, because it was never very clear before what the decision was going to be based on. I mean, we're asking people whether to go ahead with municipalization. It's kind of a yes-no question in November. At least question one is kind of a yes-no question. Okay, reasonable people might say, I'm still nervous about this. How can you help me be a little less nervous? And that's where I think amending number 4 could help. So I think it's a positive.
Okay, Sam?
So, I agree, Matt, 100% net present value is really the only thing I've ever looked at, but that can also translate into future rates, right? So it's a question of what people care about. I think we want to regulate based on what the community cares most about. I think the reason the community cares about net present value is it translates into rates at the end of the day. And so I'm where Aaron is. I don't think I'm ready to go forward right now. But I think as we have this discussion with the community about do we want to proceed with this, we should be communicating everything. Net present value, carbon reductions, rate impacts, those are all important. And so I think there's a role for it. I just think that's not as accessible to most people as rates is.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Jan?
Yeah, I would just agree that you should go ahead and, my personal opinion is that it would be good to go ahead and write something up so we can just look at it and continue to keep our options open.
Okay, it's 3-ish to 4-ish. All right, well, do you want to
I was
propose?
just going to point out that Lisa also has commented on this online.
But she didn't really, did she? She just said, don't do 189, but she didn't, I didn't see her.
I'm looking at, she said, I don't think now is the time to delete section 189. Seems like we have plenty of time to do that once we form.
Right, so she did 5, she just didn't do 4. So I'm not sure how she thinks. Right now, I think we're 4-4
4.
on number 4.
I thought, maybe I miscounted. So how do you divide up the 4 again?
Bob, Jan, Matt. Oh, I think I put you in that category. Do you don't want to, do you want to,
No, I'm the one that raised the point, right? Kicking it down the road.
kicking it down the road, sorry, okay. All right, we're being muddy and we're not making decisions tonight anyhow. I'd say we're pretty mixed about how much time we want you to spend on this, but,
Okay, so why don't we just sort of try to flesh it out a little bit more and bring it back July 11th and see where council wants to go. We won't do a lot of work on it. We won't actually draft ordinances, but we can come up with a better description of what we're talking about, and council can tell us whether or not to draft an ordinance then. Is that okay?
okay, there's a compromise for you. Does that work? Okay, 5. I say not the time to do this. Does anybody disagree? Okay, and so does, okay, so does Lisa, yeah. So nobody's interested in pursuing 5.
Thank you. Great feedback, folks. So
On to the next one. So thanks for driving, Tom. My part will be talking a little bit about the potential renewal of the 0.3% sales and use tax for capital investments. So on to the next one. The staff has already started meeting with our citizen committee, and we have presented to them 34 projects that represent 10 departments having different ideas and $180 million in unfunded needs. You may recall that we've come in front of the council before showing unfunded needs on the city in terms of capital as far in excess of this. What we did, though, before going to our residents committee is that we tried to narrow it down to projects that were a little bit more near term, ones that we think the community's talked about a little bit. So we really wanted it to narrow it down for the committee so they wouldn't be confronted with $500 million worth of projects. In addition, we have solicited the community to see what projects they might be interested in, particularly nonprofits in the community. And they have so far submitted 13 projects, and it has closed. So this is the number that we've gotten. 12 organizations have made submissions, and it's around $33 million in unfunded requests. So going on, just as a reminder about what the 0.3% sales tax has produced so far, it was passed by the voters in November of 2014, and it ends at the end of this year. We've called it community, culture, and safety because we've had projects in this from all different areas. On the screen is a lovely rendering of the civic area improvements. I think that you're starting to see those come to life right now. We also made substantial improvements to the Dairy Arts Center, and we've had a number of meetings there, including the council retreat. And hopefully you've seen the great improvements that have occurred in that facility and how much it's being used now that some of those improvements have been made. We also, one of our first projects was improving Eben G. Fine Park. This had a lot of damage in the flood, and we were able to use these dollars to really restore it and make it even better than it was before. And then the University Hill pedestrian lighting was something that the students up on the hill, as well as neighbors and CU, all were very appreciative that we included. Also, if you've been to Chautauqua lately, you've seen the new sidewalk improvements along Baseline that are looking really good. So we've done a lot of good with these tax dollars, but as they begin to expire and our projects are completed, we're hopefully ready to move forward with possibly renewing the tax again. So a thing that the council talked about earlier in January or February, I'm forgetting when, we brought this for you, is the idea of instead of having a 3-year tax, having a 5 or a 7-year tax. One of the reasons for doing this is that we encountered difficulties of what we wanted to do is have an immediate impact on the community with this tax so that they would see that their tax dollars had really done something. And so that constrained us a bit in trying to find projects that were shovel-ready right away, and a lot of project work needed to be done up front. If we have a little bit longer time to do it, and we think we've proven ourselves in this 3 years, we'll be able to have more projects, and some of them can be in the out years so that we can graded out a little bit. So the 0.3% sales tax, if for 5 years, would produce around $55 million in sales and use tax revenues. 7 years, $78 million. One thing that we want to remind you about, as we are reminding the committee as well, is that we could change the way we were doing it a little bit. So with the 0.3% we've had for 3 years, we've been doing what we call pay-as-you-go. So we don't do the project until we have the dollars. With this length of tax, we could do some tax anticipation notes and float a debt that would give us some flexibility. What that would allow is, if it was 5 years, we could get $55 million up front, or we could get, say, $40 million up front and do the rest as pay-as-you-go. So we're talking a little bit about flexibility. We don't know where the committee will end up. And if you have any guidance for us this evening or for the committee, we'd love to hear about it. So then let me tell you just a little bit about the committee and what they're up to. We got a lot of applications, and we have a really great group of folks. They are gender balanced. They're from all over the community, different ages, represent lots of different walks of life, if you will, in our community, and they're really doing a great job. So far, they've had 3 meetings. The first meeting was drinking from the fire hose and learning everything that they possibly could about city capital funding and tax revenues, and it was a tough meeting for them, but they did a great job. The second 2 meetings have been the city staff presenting the city focused projects. And at the end of each of the meetings, they've had some clicker voting to see which projects they're most interested in. The next meeting is coming up this Thursday, and the community projects will be presented. So the community groups are coming to the meeting. They will be talking about their project, answering questions that the committee might have. So they're doing a really great job. Among the things that they are looking at is the duration of the tax, 5 or 7 years, and what the different funding packages would be. They've made no decisions because they haven't seen all the projects yet, but that's going to be one of their main tasks as they move forward. So on to the next slide. Yeah. So another task that they've been engaged in recently is trying to decide how are they going to make their decisions. And so they have come up with some draft guiding principles. These have not been adopted by the group yet because they're still talking about it, but they want to guide themselves on how will they select the projects. So the things that they're looking at is that a project should have a wide community benefit. They should promote or enhance public safety, show a direct benefit to the taxpayers, possibly achieve multiple goals, be easy for the community to visualize, and enhance livability of the community. I think they'll be making some decisions in the next couple of weeks about finalizing these guiding principles. And again, if council has any recommendations in this regard, they'd be very interested in your input. So another thing that the committee cares about is the community and community input. So at the beginning of each meeting, they are allowing members of the public to speak to them. And they also are talking about, in their own circles of influence, talking to friends, neighbors, maybe underrepresented groups, people that they know, to try to just get as much input as they can about what the community cares about. And then a major question that I'll be asking you later is this. The committee is beginning to believe and is recommending to us and to you that we do a community survey, a statistically valid phone poll on the proposed projects and the packages when they're developed. They think that that will be helpful to the community and helpful to the council in making decisions about what to place on the ballot. Staff has done an informal bid process and has possibly selected a vendor that would conduct the poll if the council wants to move forward with it. We believe the cost of it would be approximately $20,000 to do that kind of a phone survey. And in talking with the vendor, and it's Bob Drake, so just so you know, he is recommending that if we do a phone poll, that it include any other tax measures that we might put on the ballot so that you have a good sense of if there's too many tax measures on, maybe they would all fail, but just sort of trying to weigh them all against one another. So that's a big question that I'll be asking you tonight about whether or not you want us to move forward with that, because we will need to do so in the June timeframe. And then the committee is also talking about what their role will be once the measures go on the ballot. So in the event that you do put this on the ballot, some of them are thinking, we'd like to be advocates for it, and they've been asking questions about the city staff's role in that. And so we've been very clear that the Campaign Finance Act does not allow us to advocate for or against ballot measures. And so they understand that, and they're just thinking about what their own personal role might be. So then, where we are right now is that the community group presentations are coming up later this week. They will be developing the packages in their next two meetings in late May and early June, and they will develop those packages by the middle of June. Hopefully, I'm hoping by maybe June 10th-ish. They're suggesting that we conduct the phone poll in late June and early July, and then staff will analyze that and bring the committee recommendation to the city council. And the council will have the opportunity to pass ballot measure, if you choose to do so, and put something on the ballot in August. So that's kind of the timing that we've got going here. So the questions that we have for council is, do you have any specific feedback for the committee? So some of the things that we talked about is perhaps council thinks, oh, 5 years is what we really should go for. Let's forget 7 years. Or we'd really like a particular project to be highly considered, or guiding principles. So any feedback that you might have for them, they would very much welcome. And then finally, we are interested in knowing if you will support us performing a telephone survey to gauge the likelihood of voting for this or not. And that's my presentation.
Okay, I guess we have a lot of questions because I know I have several.
Sure.
Let's ask questions. I guess one of the last ones, just on this poll,
Yes.
Bob Drake says on all measures. So if we said yes, we'd be polling on Muni, we'd be polling on broadband, we'd be polling on all of them?
What his suggestion would be is that we poll on items that would raise taxes.
Just that?
Just that.
Okay, interesting. Did you want to?
I was just going to colloquy, raise taxes or maintain taxes?
Well, anything having
That
to
are
do with
about
taxes.
taxes.
Okay.
Anything having to do with dollars.
So
money.
that could be utility occupation tax?
Yes, it could be the
Well, and it could be
renewal.
broadband, so
Right,
it
it
could
could be
be-
broadband, it could be, yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing is you mentioned packages. So are they preparing scenarios, different types of packages of projects, or?
They haven't gotten to that point yet, but what I can imagine that they would do is they may say, we want to have a set of projects if there was a 5-year renewal, or if there were a 7-year renewal, and they would choose different things because there'd be more in the 7-year renewal. Or they might say, we want to figure out what kind of package we'd have if it was 5-year pay-as-you-go versus 40 million upfront and the rest of it pay-as-you-go. So they might choose different scenarios that way. So they haven't talked about it yet.
But that's what you're thinking? That's what you
I
meant
want-
by packages?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, I want them to have the flexibility to be creative about the things that our community wants and that we could fund it in this tax renewal.
Okay, and my last question is simply, can you just say a little bit more, maybe Bob or whoever, about the payment options, and if you do debt financing, obviously that costs a little bit more, but on the other hand, then everything
so-
has to be shovel-ready or not, or I just want to understand.
Right, so debt financing does cost something. However, if we have a project that we need to save up for through pay-as-you-go, if we have to save up for 6 years, what we're finding is that construction costs go up around 10% a year. And so it's actually cheaper to pay for the debt financing up front than to just have to save the money over that period of time, because the cost of the project will have gone up a lot.
Okay, all right, so we have Sam, Jan, Bob. Sorry, were you up? Oh, you don't have questions? Okay, who's got any more questions? Yep.
So, phone poll, what was the thinking behind that? Because there's some question about how many people you get on phone polls, people with cell phones that are harder to reach out to, versus a written one like we just did for the, we were advised to do a written one by the folks who did the survey for the comp plan.
A written one takes longer to do, and the latest technology, I guess, around phone polls that we've heard people talk about does get people with cell phones. And so we're hearing from our consultants that phone polls are as accurate as written ones.
Okay. Is that it for you? Jan? Matt?
My question, Jane, was about the committee.
Yes.
And the 13 projects that have been submitted, will the committee narrow those down?
Yes, the committee will take a look at all of them, and then they'll make a decision to include some, all, or none of them in
the packages.
in the packages
I
that
see,
they bring
okay.
forward. So it's not a foregone conclusion that there will be community projects or that there won't be. We don't know what there will be.
And what about the city projects? How does that enter the process, both with the committee and with the council? And then how do they, how do they judge the community projects vis-a-vis the city projects?
So that's why they're coming up with guiding principles to make sure that any projects that they pick will be impactful to the community. I'll just say it as quickly as that. And so they will just judge it based on their view of how impactful a project might be. So a project that's not very sexy is the radio infrastructure that we need for our public safety. So they may say, well, that doesn't sound on first blush like a compelling project. It's really needed for public safety, and so that may rise to the top for them. And then they may say, well, but we want a package that is a little bit more compelling, a little bit more interesting, so let's add in something related to one of the parks or the reservoir. And then we really want to garner community support, and we think that a lot of people care about this nonprofit organization, so we'll add that in. So it's really just sort of, in a way, ballot calculus, voter calculus about what projects the community will find impactful, it'll increase livability here, and ones that they think that the community will want to vote for. And so they'll create the packages for you, but what I will want to make sure of is that you see how they've ranked them. So if they have a project that didn't quite make the cut, you'll see that it didn't quite make the cut, and council will be the one ultimately to put them on the ballot or not. And so you can say, that didn't make the cut, but one of them they put on, we don't like that much, or it's not as good as this one. So you will make the final decision. It's just that we are trying to get as much community input as we can so that we get the sense of what the community cares the most about.
Then if I can just summarize what you said, the committee will be looking at both the city proposed projects as well as the nonprofit.
Yes.
They'll be creating some recommendations for council to consider at perhaps both price levels or cost levels.
Yes.
And so then we'll review what they've already narrowed down on both sides.
Right.
Okay,
That's right.
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so Jane, let me, your last statement there, actually, it's partly some feedback, but it's really a question too in terms of the committee work. Because what you said was the committee is going to, at least the way you explained it, try to balance everything and say, well, we need a project here because maybe it'll attract some voters. But you're also going to provide us, and this is the question, with kind of, in a way, their raw judgment, which is what I'd like to see. I mean, I got to tell you, I don't think it's the committee's role necessarily to decide which projects are sexy and which ones are going to garner votes. That kind of sounds like council's role. I'd like the committee to say, here are really the best projects. Yeah, council, I mean, we're a political body. We might say, okay, we got to put one of these in because it might garner some votes. I get it. But I'd first like to see really what is most important in a way, or at least the committee's judgment about what's most important to the community. So that's the question. Are we really going to see that, or is that going to kind of get jumbled up with these other considerations, so you'll
now
never
that-
get a clear...
Right. Now that you said that, like, that's the kind of feedback I'm looking for, right? Okay? So that's what we will be communicating to the committee, is that council wants your straight-up judgment about which are the best projects for our community.
Okay, all right. I'm
But
not sure,
can I-
not sure I would have thought of that if the question hadn't been asked, but since it
Let me
was...
colloquy. But also, they say these are the most meritorious, but we want to see a mix of, and this is my question about the public safety thing, we want to see a mixture of culturally inviting and public safety. So that's the guide, that could be guidance they give us as well.
Right, that could
Okay.
be.
And that's fine.
Because they're rationale, they're thinking,
Right.
is what we want.
Right.
Can I
So,
Okay, and then
follow up
Bob.
on that point?
Yeah.
all right.
Or
No, I got some more questions, but if you want to follow up on that, it's fine.
please, in terms of your feedback on that, I mean, I agree that we need to look at what's most impactful for the community, but I think part of the benefit from this would be having a balanced set of measures. And so that's not so much about, well, what are people going to vote for, but it's more of, we probably don't want all of one kind of project. We want to, create a balance of different kinds of things that we're funding. So I would say, in addition to thinking about what's most impactful, there should be a balance of the kinds of things we're funding.
But as long as they include their rationale, I think that's useful. They're thinking on these matters, so we know if we disagree about a particular project, but they think it should be balanced, anyhow, that's what I think is useful.
Okay, a few other questions. Operating costs. I mean, the committee's looking at capital costs. Is anybody looking at operating costs? And that's not just for the city projects. It could also be for the other projects where inevitably the city ends up footing the bill for things.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. As we have had staff present a project, we also provide the committee with information about how much it's going to cost to operate a particular capital facility. And some of them have been very interested in that, and so they will weigh that before they put a project forward.
Well, needless to say, I'm interested in that.
Right, well,
Because
certainly.
I mean, as I've said many times, we can usually find money to do capital. I mean, not $800 million worth, but the hard part's spending X million a year running them, where that's just difficult. So, that's really important. And it's not the committee's role, of course, other than looking at the numbers, to figure out where the money comes from and what doesn't get spent. I suppose that's your role, about giving us some advice about whether, this department they wouldn't be spending money here anymore, they'd move it to here, or no, they'd really need an extra budgetary allotment because that's what it would take. Because, I don't know, I'll just make this up. It's a new park, so it's just going to cost more money to operate a new park, which is fine, but the money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're aware of it, and we'll present that information too.
And then in terms of the so-called community projects, insofar as some of them are using city land, are we calculating the value of the land, or more importantly, the value of replacing the land or whatever on it?
I don't know the answer to that, but we totally can do that. Do you want
Well,
to
it
answer
sure seems to me you need to do it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Joel Wagner to come up. So Joel Wagner, who you know full well from the finance department, and Jean Gatza have been working on it, and Darren Wagner from Open Space has been facilitating. So Joel is a little bit more knowledgeable than I am and can answer your question.
Hi, good evening. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, they're starting to look at it. We've just started to get review and questions from the community group, and I have to say I'm really impressed at the level of detail that a lot of these are going into, and they've already really, they've cut to the quick on a lot of these, including some of these projects would require relocation of staff, and they're asking about what kind of conversations these groups have had with staff, what planning they are, and then coming back to us as well as what stages we are on that.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting it precludes anything. It doesn't. It's just you need to get a full, it's all well and good to say this is going to cost $2 million to build it, but if it's then going to cost the city $3 million to relocate what's there, well, then it's $5 million. It's not $2 million anymore. And somebody has to come up with that money. So that's important to me. All right, thanks. And the last question I have is, so this tax, if it were passed, would go into effect January 2018, essentially. So 2 years after that, the general fund gets, I believe, an extra 0.11, because one of the other taxes, this was the deal we made a long time ago, the very complicated ballot issue in 2013. Not suggesting that the general fund couldn't use that money, but I'm just wondering whether there wouldn't be a way to maybe roll some of that into a capital tax as well, and then get a little more money for capital and be able to do some more projects. Because this is going to be, I mean, this is once in 5 or 7 years, perhaps. It's going to be a long time before we come back to this.
So you're right to remember that. A possibility for that, if it were not capital, would be to help operate some of the new facilities that might be created. We have a lot to talk about this year with regard to the budget, and I know you've been getting some emails about people concerned about property taxes. They are going up, and that might be another source of capital funding for the future.
Yeah, that was kind of the next question, although just for the record, folks, the actual, even though people's assessments went up by 25%, mine did too, taxes are only going to go up by half of that because of the insanity of the Gallagher amendment. So we need to, it's not like it's a small increase, but it's not a 25% increase. And it's almost impossible to explain to anybody why that's the case, but it is nonetheless the case.
And we're working on a response to some of those emails, and it will go out later.
Yeah, that would be helpful. But no, that was another question about those. Right. So, all right, it all rolls together. You need to know what the operating costs are, and then you can maybe have a sense of, is there some other money that could help roll into this? Because again, I think it's once every 7 years or so. And, you know, you want to do as many projects as you can. The odds are there won't be anything else during that 7-year period.
Right.
All right, thanks.
Bob,
I didn't have any questions. I was just going to start answering.
I think we're ready to move forward, right?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have 3 things to say, Jane. One, with respect to the 5 years versus 7 years, you kind of maybe signaled that you would be interested in hearing on that. I've always had a bit of a bias towards the shorter time just because it takes us out of the market. I mean, as we look at the other taxes that are coming up for renewal, with the exception of the one that Matt mentioned, I don't think we have a whole lot coming up in the next decade or so. And I worry a little bit about, needs change, 5 years from now, 7 years from now, who knows what our needs are going to be. And so I have a bias towards a shorter tax. I leave it entirely to the finance department about what part gets bonded and what part is pay as you go. That I'll leave to you guys. But what it would be really helpful, I think, for us is if the committee came back to us and said, if it was 5 years, if we had $55 million to spend, here's the projects, both community and in the city, that we would do. And if we had 78 million, here's the other projects we would do. Because then we can look at that second list and say, gosh, there's some really important things here, and maybe we should just bite the bullet and go for 7 years. Or maybe you say, hey, listen, this stuff is kind of discretionary. Let's talk about those in 5 years. None of them seem to be of great urgency. So that's, I guess, the kind of guidance that I'd like to have from the committee is 5-year tax and a 7-year tax and what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And can we just clarify on that? The phone, if we decide to do a phone poll, that could be one of their questions about 5 versus 7?
Yes, it could be.
Okay, because that might be useful too.
So second point is I'm going to slightly disagree with Matt. Jane, could you go back to the slide that talks about the criteria that they're considering? That one. I actually would appreciate the input of the committee, because there are 12, as you say, Jane, very representative members of our community, about what they think their fellow voters would support. Because at the end of this process, they're going to be the subject matter experts. They're going to know more about these projects as a whole than any of the rest, certainly than us and most members of the community. And while, yes, they could give us the raw data, yeah, this is a more worthy project than that, and we could then exercise our political discretion to say, well, yeah, but we think this one's more likely to get the voters' approval. I actually would appreciate them taking both the raw data, the information they've gathered, and their judgment. I'd like to hear their judgment on what they think would be, and they can express it any way. They could say, hey, listen, if it was only the 12 of us voting, here's what we do. But you know what? We live in a rural world, and there's going to be 30,000 people voting. Here's what we think you should do. I really would value their judgment. As a matter of fact, I'd go a step further and actually add another criteria, which is a project should, it's kind of implied here through all these, but I would actually be explicit about it and say that will draw community support. Or will draw voter support, be even more direct about it, because I would really value their judgment on that. And I, having served on one of these committees in 2011, I think we did exercise that judgment. I think we even used the word sexy repeatedly. Is this project sexy enough to draw? Because you know what, we can talk all we want about needs, but you know what, if the voters voted down, none of the projects are going to get done. So I think their judgment on what is sexy and what the voters will support is really going to be important to me. And then finally, with respect to the phone poll, I'm kind of ambivalent about it. And this kind of ties to my last point. I'd rather hear from the 12 of them than do a phone poll. And I know it's going to be statistically valid and so on and so forth. I'm just not sure what we do with that information, because it's either going to be too early or too late. It's either going to be so early in the process that our questions of the voters are going to be inarticulate. And we're going to say, yeah, there's going to be some stuff, but we're not really too sure what it's going to be. And if it's too late, I'm not sure, what do we do at that point in time? I mean, maybe that's a forecast to us that the measure is going to pass or fail, or that we have to work harder to get it to pass. But I'm not super thrilled about these types of polls. I think we should just put our best foot forward and the poll is in November.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Mary.
So I actually think that these guiding principles are great as they are, and I would like, the committee has these to work with and to look at the projects based on these, in light of these guiding principles. And what I would like to see is their evaluation of the projects before them based on these guiding principles. What are the best? Regardless of whether it's balanced on sexy or cultural or safety, what do they think are the best, just based on these guiding principles, what are the best ones? And then we can make the other decisions. I think until you've gone through an election, you don't have a sense for what voters may or may not want. And so I just don't think that they are, that shouldn't be their mission.
Sam, we'll just go down there, and then Aaron.
So just speaking on the guiding principles, I like everything that's up there. I would add one about increasing inclusivity or increasing welcoming nature as a city, because I think that's an important one that we're focused on right now, given the political environment that we're living in nationally. If you go back to the questions, that would help me out. Oops, one passed. I'd like the advisory committee to advise, which means to me that they make recommendations. So they order projects, and I like the idea of a 5-year cluster and a 7-year cluster. So what they would do, depending on what the duration of the tax was. But I also would appreciate their advice on, we think this package is useful. Now, council will do what council will do with that advice, and I'm sure that they'll understand that, but I would appreciate them talking about a rationale for how they grouped the packages in the 5-year, the 7-year. I don't think there's any harm in that, and there's probably a lot of benefit. And then as far as the poll goes, I mean, I hear what Bob's saying. At the same time, what I would think it would be best done if it were put out there would be something for the working group to use to inform their decision making. So I would prefer to err on the side of earlier, and what we would be talking about is things like 5 years or 7 years. Do you generally support this extension? Here are some of the types of projects that were done previously. Do you, first of all, you can do open-ended questions where the public can then contribute project ideas. I think sometimes there's good value in that. But you could try and cluster them, is one of these types, safety or culture or missing the third one. Are any of these more important to you? Are any of these principles more important to you? I just think you could get good guidance for the working group, and that would be probably how you'd want to do it.
Let me interject, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the timing that we have is actually not going to support our doing a poll to inform the group. This group will be done with its work in the June 8th to 10th timeframe. Is that right, Joel?
Sorry. We have started to just float the idea of maybe pushing a meeting out or having an additional meeting if they want to incorporate that idea yet, but nothing's on the schedule.
Right, so they would have to extend their term, if you will, into July in order for this to happen, and we don't know if they are willing to do that or not. So I just want to be realistic here that we might not be able to get that to happen.
So, I mean, to the extent I agree with Bob is that I'm not sure what we do with the results of the poll if they indicate that there's not a lot of support. I think we should put the choice to the voters in any case. I would think the value would be if there's any way it can inform the group's discussions. So maybe you can ask the group if they agree with that or disagree with it. Were you thinking of this, was staff thinking of this mostly as a pre-election poll or more of a poll, does council want to, in light of this knowledge, put this on the ballot?
So I will give you my view is that I actually don't think that we should do a poll, but the group thinks that it would be helpful information for council about making the decision about what to include in the package that council would put before the voters.
Okay, well, I'm more inclined not to do it if it's going to be an election tool or something that is going to inform us about what to put forward. I think hearing from them is going to be the most important thing for me about that because I think they'll have a really probably solid package. So if it were going to help them make their decision or decisions and they have asked for it or suggested it, then I'm willing to support it to do that, but not if it's after they've essentially put the packages together.
So I liked what Bob said about timing. I'm interested in hearing about the different baskets or clusters or whatever we might call them, so to get us some options. But I think it's a good point about a bias towards a shorter term so that future community needs can be addressed a few years down the road. But I'm interested in what the options are. In terms of the poll, I mean, it could be interesting to hear what people in the community are most value. But at the same time, if we're working on packages that we think complement each other, which was my comment before, I don't know that we want to go out and then say, well, this one got 4% more support, so we'll put this one in. This one got 3% less, we'll take it out. I'm less a fan of that. So I guess I'm a little agnostic on the question of the poll. And one thing I had, let's see, on the guiding principles. There's a bit of an implication in the way that they were put up there, that every project should meet every guiding principle, and
that would not be possible, right? So no.
Yeah, so we want to just make that clear that
Yeah.
here's a bunch of goals and satisfy as many of them as we can. I thought Sam's point was an interesting one about adding a principle about being welcoming and inclusive, or maybe another way to think about that is, how does the project help members of underrepresented communities, something like that. So I'm not sure about exactly how you word that, but I'd be interested in seeing criteria that looked at those issues.
Matt?
Yeah, I mostly agree. So one other, I guess step back for a second. One other question I've got is, insofar as some of these potential projects relate to specific departments, so Library North Branch or a transportation project, those are things that pop into my mind. I mean, are we going to go back and ask those boards whether those are really the top priorities for them? If this really is a once in every 5 or 7 year deal, I'll just pick a transportation project randomly because there's a bunch on the list. I don't particularly want to pluck one out that the committee thinks is cool and then tab in the transportation department says, you know, that would not be what we really would want to do in the next 7 years. We got some other things that are way more important than that.
So all of the projects that we've presented to them have gone to the affected boards already, is my understanding. Joel, am I right on that?
Yeah, so all of the board liaisons have been presenting information, and they've presented the full project list to the boards, asked for their input and thoughts on the renewal, not specific ranking of the projects. But what I would say is all of the department projects that are here are essentially plucked off of their unfunded needs list and have gone through an extensive prioritization through the departments themselves. And we've had them look at alignment with master plans and things like that.
Right. Well, I know the library master plan's being redone, so it's a little out of sequence, but okay. It'd be nice to kind of, and maybe none of the projects will be relevant, but it'd be nice to kind of run it past some of these folks in the end and just make sure that everybody's good with it. Again, if it really is 7 years, that's a long time, and you don't want to do a project where the department and the board is sitting there scratching their heads thinking, that's just not the one we would have picked.
Right. So the timing might allow us to accomplish this. So if the group says we aren't going to extend our term into July, but they end in June, then we would have the opportunity before we come to you in August to go back to probably all of the boards. I mean, it would have to be a short item on their agendas, but we probably could make it back to the boards to just check in with them.
Right. Well, it's just an
June, July
observation.
timeframe.
If it works, that's great. If not, so be it. I mean, the boards have other ways of communicating with us if they choose to, so that's okay. I'm fine with the guiding principles. They seem reasonable. Bob, I really didn't disagree with you about the committee putting together a package or two based on a variety of things. I just also thought it would be useful to see the kind of pre-packaged conversation, as it were, because we might have a slightly different take on the packaging. I mean, there are however many people, we're however many people. Nobody knows exactly what is the best packaging strategy. They don't and we don't. But, I'd like to see we've been calling it the raw data. Maybe it's a little bit of an overstatement, but at least kind of the before we packaged it all together, what they really thought were the important things. I think that'd be really helpful. On the polling, I just don't know what it will tell us. I don't see the polling. I mean, there was some discussion about, well, the polling could tell us how to put together the package, but it sounds like the polling would be already a package. And the only way you could ask people what types of things they wanted is if you gave them the whole laundry list again and said, well, do you like this one? Do you like this one? Do you like this one? That we know is really hard because just as the committee, I'm sure, found out, you have to know a lot to answer those questions. You have to be told a lot about the projects. Even the package, you have to know something. And again, just to use a trivial example, most people, I think, will fund fire stations, but if you don't know that the real issue is it's in the floodplain, it's ancient and doesn't serve our purposes anymore, it is in the wrong place, you might not think it's quite as high a priority. Oh, it's just a fire station, why do they need one? Well, that's why we need one. But who knows that? Well, we do, but, who else knows it? So I'm a little nervous about that. I mean, Sam, you kind of said it, this is just an election poll. Is it really useful? I'm not sure it's really useful until it's kind of out and about and people are focusing on it. And the other concept of the poll that Bob Drake brought up, that really doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, I get the theory of there could be multiple taxes on the ballot and they play one off against another. Believe me, I get that. But boy, the other ones, people aren't going to know anything about them at the time the poll is being done. I mean, it's just going to be this cold call, essentially. Gee, do you like this broadband tax?
Well, that's why he's saying to compare them And if 5 taxes were on the ballot, right?
But I don't think they're going to know enough. I mean, not if this is done in June. We won't have deals with people. We won't know outcomes of things that we'll know by the time November comes along. I think it'd be a really hard question to ask anybody. So, I mean, Bob's right in general, but I just think the timing doesn't allow for it. Again, I think he's thinking more of an election poll than of helping you fashion something. And they're really two different concepts.
Jan?
Thanks. I thought you were doing a round robin there. I love this this committee, and I think it's fantastic that you've got them together and they've come from different backgrounds. I think I would really like to see at least 2 options on the 55 million, and then I think Bob suggested then if they would then add projects to the next level, maybe make that an additional option so that there aren't too many. But they may even have a great way to structure that. So I'm really excited about having them involved. And I think one thing that we need to maybe talk to them about, because I really sense the community is going to be upset about their property taxes. And I don't know what our options are and when we'll actually discuss them in terms of if we have an opportunity to lower the mill levy. But I think giving them some purview to that, because I think it is going to be a factor in getting this passed and how people feel about their overall taxation. And then in question 2, I'm not going to respond to that because since you mentioned Bob's name, he was my finance chairman, and I think I shouldn't have any comment on that whatsoever.
Okay, I'll just jump in real quick. I'll just note that, shockers, Lisa Morzell would like a North Boulder library. Okay? As would Aaron. Okay, that was her input. I guess 2 things. The criteria, it helps that you said not every project has to do everything, but the previous tax was community, culture, and safety, and the one that's called out is safety. And I thought that was a little odd because one could argue that cultural arts only indirectly helps with safety. So anyhow, I just think it's worth noting that. And there are some community projects that are environmental, but if you think of them as contributing community, anyhow, to me, it's not really clear. They could be clearer about if they're also talking about other things. And maybe one way to get at community, the inclusivity and underrepresented, is in the context of a criteria that talks about building community. So anyhow, I think they could maybe be a little clearer about if it really is a community, culture, and safety tax or not.
So the last time we did this, we named it community, culture, and safety as part of the shorthand to discuss the projects. And what we told the committee at the first meeting is that we weren't going to name it up front. We weren't going to presume that it would be the same thing. But that as they selected the projects, we would, and as the council ultimately made the decision, that a name would arise from that, and it might end up being Community, Culture, and Safety Part 2. But we want to see what projects rise to the surface. And so I personally believe that the public safety was put on there because they want to have some public safety projects, but that it's not exclusive to that. And they're very open to the community projects, to parks projects, that, you know, they're open to all things. So their guiding principles are not, you don't have to meet all of them. And we can ask them to be more explicit on that.
Well, only if you're going to grade it against, either they mean something and you're grading it against them, in which case you should be clear. Anyhow, I'm glad they know what they mean. If somebody else is going to look and see if they went by their criteria, it might be misleading.
Okay.
But the other thing is, you mentioned a little bit about whether groups are going to help, whether some of the groups are going to help with the tax. To me, right, I wasn't sure where we ended up with that. I do think there, last time, for example, 2A benefited the dairy and museums, so they helped lead the tax, which to me makes sense, but there's also, anyhow.
So where that comes from is that at the very first meeting, some of the committee members were very passionate about wanting to care about the ballot measure. And they were asking from the very beginning, what's our role after it gets on the ballot? Should we be out there advocating for it? And what is staff going to do? So we reminded them that staff certainly can't do anything that's violating the law and that we can't advocate for or against. But we said, as individuals, you certainly are welcome to do that. And so that's where that is coming from. We just wanted you to know that they're eager and anxious to care about this.
Okay, great. And then I'm agreeing with what's been said about, give us a couple packages, give us your rationale. So if it's raw data, if it's your judgment about what the voters want, just explain to us your reasoning so we can follow the breadcrumbs and disagree or not with different rationales. And then the other thing I would say is, I guess I'm with Sam on the poll. If it's going to be useful to putting it together, let's do it. Or I'm open to doing it. I don't feel strongly. That's its utility.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, who else wants to weigh in? Anything else? Yep.
I didn't weigh in on the poll, but I do think that it, also with Sam, that it would be most useful if it gave some guidance to the committee.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good enough? Good enough?
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So our next presenter is Carl Castillo. Carl is our legislative policy advisor in the city manager's office, and he will be talking to us about the broadband project.
Good evening. Great time to take a break. I'll just wait.
The TV's on in there.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the reminder. So I think this is going to be fairly short. You'll let me know. As Jane, I think, mentioned, Don is not able to join us today. He's at a Colorado Association of IT Professionals conference. Thank you. So in April 18th, Council did authorize staff to narrow the focus of its broadband effort to not include a full financing of the network. And since then, we've been moving forward with evaluating options that fill that direction. So next slide. We've been in active negotiations with the finalists, and I would include Zayo in that list of finalists. As you all may recall, we've had Ting, we've had Allo, and we've had Axia. I just spoke to Don, and he believes that in communications with our own local company, Zayo, that they should be elevated to that same level of finalists, that they've expressed sufficient interest at this point, and they're sufficiently serious that they would be in that same level. In terms of things that we've been negotiating, just this is by way of a reminder, Council did express interest in exploring the partial city funding of a network, and that would bring us two things. One is perhaps lower rates in terms of what our consumers would actually have to pay for broadband, but also the additional control that would come by having made an partial investment in the infrastructure, that we would have a little more control in the things that you see right below that bullet. So in other words, by making an investment, we're more likely to get a ubiquitous build out, more likely to get a digital equity package that really is something that is both affordable and meaningful for those who can't otherwise afford it. Open access, that's probably the holy grail of this project, is being able to not only bring in a new competitor and to have this high-speed infrastructure, but to make it available to multiple internet service providers so that we have lots more competition. An ability to contribute to our smart city objectives. So this is everything from traffic lights, public safety, could be connected in autonomous vehicles. Broadband is a foundational element of that. And finally, it's adding to the competitive environment. Of course, that is merely by bringing in a new partner that would be adding to competition, but more so having a deal that is structured so as to diminish the possibility that that new partner somehow gets bought out by one of the incumbents and returns us to the current state of affairs, which is less than ideal. Rather than summarize the negotiations, I will just mention that one of the partners that we've been very interested in has had some new information that is unfortunate. Axia, which is based in Calgary, has told us that they will no longer be following through with their expressed interest in Fort Collins or in Bloomington, Indiana. And that is due to their parent partner who has decided that their open access model is something that they're not quite comfortable continuing to fund. So this is obviously very concerning. And how this affects our willingness to continue to consider them as a partner is to be determined. They have said they are still interested in working with us. Partly what distinguishes us from Bloomington and Fort Collins is that we have, in fact, put on the table the idea of a partial investment. But to be frank, this is obviously a very serious blow to our ability to consider them, one of the finalists. But for now, they're still on there. So
Bloomington and Fort Collins, we're going to have them pay for and do it all?
Yeah, the deal that was being was really close to being finalized. In fact, I think they were just. I was speaking to Don. He was saying they were about to start building. Was that the Axia would have done the entire investment, so it was on that side of the spectrum. So Boulder would be different in that we're willing to consider at least a partial investment. So the proposal is that we would come back to you, I think we mentioned before, on July 25th with some information, actually not just some information, but with the information that you would need to make a decision about whether to go to the voters this November. So next slide. The question for council tonight is quite limited, fairly straightforward, which is, does council want staff to continue to do the research, to continue to meet and negotiate with these finalists, to bring the information back to you that will allow you to then decide whether it's appropriate to refer a measure to the voters this November. And that would be a measure that would actually increase tax and allow debt authorization. I want to clarify what is not being asked of you today, because I know there's been a lot of emails that have been sent, and there's been communications that we've heard as recently as last Thursday's broadband event. I know at least two of you were able to make it, and some of you may have heard some information. By providing staff, so if you were to say, yes, staff continue, nothing's changed since April, you've gotten some new developments, but we have a lot of work to do. It's ambitious, as Don says, let's give it the college try, see if we can get you the information that you need to feel comfortable. So if you go forward with that, that doesn't preclude the possibility that come July 25th, and when you get the information that we provide you, that you say, I got 4 different options here. You could say, well, thank you, but we want to delay the ballot measure until 2018 for whatever reason that may be. You can say, we want to, what you're bringing to us does not require a city investment, does not require a city broadband tax, but we still want to put the measure on the ballot, or a measure on the ballot, because we want to get a confirmation that our voters are comfortable with this partner. So I know at least one person has suggested that this is an important enough decision that irrespective of a tax, it should go to the voters. You would still retain that right. It could also include a franchise. So at least one of our partners that we're looking at is looking to bring a cable package along with the internet. So it could be that in addition to a tax measure, it could be a franchise agreement measure. So all those things would still be available to you. You could also decide that after hearing what we report back, that, a private partnership isn't really what we thought it was going to be. It's not, and perhaps it's not as encouraging as you thought. And you could then say, let's resurface the idea of a full public build, full public finance. So that option would still be available to you. Or you could even say, let's delay this, or let's abandon it altogether for whatever reason. Maybe municipalization should be completely fleshed out, how many years in the future, whatever it may be. So all those options, which basically have been suggested to you by people who have emailed to you, I just want to make clear that they are still on the table. They will be available to you. You will just have more information to make that decision. clearly council, our staff is hopeful that we will be able to provide you with information that allows you to go forward with a tax measure this November. But we recognize that's a heavy lift. So just wanted to make that clear. So with that, I'll end it and take any questions that you may have.
Questions? Dan?
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah.
If there were a tax, what type of tax would it be?
It would be a property tax. And beyond that, I'd have to ask Bob Ikem, would you like more information on that? Because I don't have it.
Excuse me. Thank you, Carl. I'm Bob Ikem. I work in the finance area and working on this project. It could either be a sales tax or it could be a property tax. With partial, the first time we did it, we said if you want to do the whole thing with the city, it could be to a 0.2 or a 0.3 sales tax or between 2 to 3 mils. If we do the partial one, like we talked last time on the 18th of April, it may be between 1 to 2%. 0.1 or 0.2, meaning 1/10 or 2/10, or 1 or 2 mils. But it depends which one we'd be looking at, which one we'd be doing. But it could be a property or a sales tax.
And just to clarify, so when he says a partial or full, so what we're currently exploring is this partial city investment, not the full, the full financing of the infrastructure.
And can you talk about the process of, and the current assessments have gone up quite a lot. And so unless we adjust the mill levy, then everyone's taxes will be going up anyway. So would this be incremental to that, or would they get that value? Is that something they would get based on the fact that their house just went up, skyrocketed by 25%? And what is the timing of all that analysis? The kind of assessment of mill levies versus this?
It could be either. You could look at that as a part of the increase, or it could be standalone separately, so voters could work on it. The city hasn't in the past, before the Tabor restrictions were removed by the voters in 2007. We use a mill levy credit. We don't reduce the mill levy itself because you can never raise it again without a vote. If you do that with the credit, you can. Because you can go back up. If we've had years where the valuations weren't total, so we can move it up. So it could be either, and it doesn't have to be a property tax. It can be a sales tax, but we would look at all options, and when that would be analyzed is through the budget process. Now, if you want to put it on the ballot, though, we will accelerate that process so we can bring those numbers back to you.
Could you, hey, Bob, as long as you're here, can you just back up and do a little 101 on tax just the process with regard to property tax, just in terms of who does what and what, if we're going to adjust mill levies? I think there's a lot of confusions out there about who's in charge and how does this work, and it might be useful.
It's not simple to explain, but I will try my best.
Well, okay, give us the.
When you hear the valuations are going up 35%, that does not mean your property tax bill is going up 35%. The Gallagher Amendment, which was passed in 1982, says that there will be a ratio relationship between commercial and residential. And because commercial is set, what happens then over time is if your house, let's make this real easy on me, is $1 million. The property fair market value of your house is $1 million. Right now, for assessment purposes, it's roughly about 8% that is taken, okay? So $80,000. And then the mill levy is applied to that. Whereas if you're a business, and it's $1 million worth of your value, it's assessed at 28%, or $280,000 times the mill levy. That's that relationship between Gallagher that causes so many. So there are other restrictions, some statutory restrictions on the counties and the school districts that the city does not have. And those are where you get into the Tabor and what was voted out, but also how much it can go up per year. Council always has the final say on how much the property tax can go up. But that would be discussed during the budget process.
And can you speak to the Gallagher Amendment change, the changes coming this year because of the Gallagher Amendment?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear you.
Can you speak to the changes coming this year because of the Gallagher Amendment requirements?
Yeah, they keep changing the numbers. If they originally thought that the relationship, that 28% would, stay for commercial, but it stays at that. So that means the residential is going to be pressed down even more. They were talking closer to, I think it was like 6.5%, but I don't know that that's been finalized yet.
I think the final number is about 7.2. The last number I saw,
Yeah.
and that's about a 10% drop from what it currently is. So you got to do the math, but yes, assessments went up, but the valuation of residential, you got to be careful, the residential properties went down by about 10%. Commercial properties, of course, didn't go down at all. So they're now paying about 4 times as much as residential. It's it's almost exactly a 4-to-1 ratio.
So I have a question as well. Is the county debruced? So the city is debruced, so we manage our small slice of the property tax revenues relative to the county who collects them, I believe. What is is the school district debruced, or do they still have to abide by Tabor?
I believe they are on the local level because they receive
They
a
are
lot of their
what?
funding per individual. from the
Debruced,
state.
in other
They are
words, they do no longer have to comply with
No,
Tabor.
I just didn't know what you said when you said they are. I just didn't know.
So they are at the local level.
I believe at the local level, they are out from under that, but a lot of their funding comes from the state level, depending on how much you get per student, and that can come from many different sources. The county, I believe, is also out from under the Tabor restrictions. I would be remiss in saying the portion of the amount of property tax that you pay on your bill, roughly about 13% of that comes to the city. The greatest portion of it goes to the school district and to the county.
Right, and so because the school district and the county, at least the portions that are funded off of property tax bills from within the city, if they are debruced so they no longer have to comply with Tabor, then all they're doing is complying with the Gallagher Amendment. Because
There's one other restriction on statutory entities, and I'm sure it applies to the counties, but I'm not sure of the school district, is they can only go up so much each year, the amount of revenue they can collect. I think that's 5.5. I'm not certain.
So that's where I was going with this, because as long as we're trying to unpeel the onion a little bit here, so you say that's a statutory limit on the school district, but it's not Tabor, which has
Statutory limit on the county.
It's on the county. I don't know if it's on the school district either, but it is on the county.
So if it's on the county, then what that means is there's yet another layer of complexity here.
Right.
Because not only is it that you have to keep the ratios between the commercial and residential properties the same, but this limit that is applied to how fast the revenues can go up relative to previous years means that there's what I used to call, when I was thinking about fire department funding, was a fudge factor. And what the fudge factor does is takes and says that all will come down by a certain amount. So in other words, when you look at your property tax bill and you see the mill levy being applied to a number that's much smaller than the value of your house, that's some combination of the Gallagher Amendment plus this countywide fudge factor plus whatever the school boards do plus what we do. So it is indeed very complicated, but what it almost always means is the sticker shock of your home assessment going way up is going to be a lot greater than the sticker shock you'll see when you get your bill from the
So somebody needs to do the math, and somebody will, obviously. I don't think they know all the numbers yet. But so if in Boulder the average residential property went up 25% or 26%, if you factor all of this stuff in, this kind of incomprehensible stuff in, you probably end up, assuming the mill levy stay the same, you probably wind up with a tax increase, and I'm just guessing now, of something like 11 or 12%. But some smart person's going to have to do the math at some point.
So, and Jane, did you mention that the city staff is putting together a response to concerns about property tax increases? So, and can all these pieces of information that we're talking about be incorporated into that?
I think they can. However, as Matt and Sam are pointing out, these other minor adjustments are ones that we don't know about because other taxing entities own, if you will, their decisions in that regard. And so we don't know what they will decide. But we can provide, I think, an overarching statement that will help people understand how it works and what small percentage of their total tax bill goes to the city of Boulder.
Right, because you could frame the overall situation and the overall numbers and then say, now other bodies have decision-making
Right.
authorities over those bigger pieces. 13% of it is from us. Here's and here's how that plays out.
Right.
So that's helpful. Now, if we reapply it to this question, now, Bob, you said we could be adding an increment on top of that, or we could include it in this.
Until we run those may be possibilities, but until, as Matt said, until we run the numbers, know what it means, we'll not be able to give you that information. But we will do our best to lay that out. If you want us to come back on the 25th, we could try to do that. When I say 0.1 or 0.2, it can be lower than the 0.1. It just depends how that partnership would be structured, because we looked at one, it could be 15 to 20 million. Another one, it could be 40 to 50 million. If we owned it, it's 100 to 140 million, depending on if we do all the drops and things and how much is undergrounded. So there's a wide range of what could be done. And it could be property tax or sales tax, and we could try to bring that back on the property tax aspect, if you want us to go ahead.
The one thing I will add is, so he brought it all the way up to the 140 million. One thing you will not get from us on July 25th is a recommendation to spend 140 million or raise 140 million for full financing. If that is a recommendation, that would be something that would be for another year, because that's not the direction that we've received from you at this point.
Okay, so now we're ready to jump in, Aaron, and then Mary, in terms of answering this question.
Right. And so, yes, absolutely. Please do continue researching the possibility and bring it back to us. Thank you for coming here tonight and doing the presentation. And I do feel pretty strongly that the funding mechanism that we should look at should be a property tax mechanism, because it's less regressive and it's tied to the value of the property that people own. I think these infrastructure improvements, it makes sense to do it that way. But with these big increases in assessed values, I'd really like, if we can, to get as much information about how the property tax finances are going to play out over the next couple of years, and use that, incorporate that in our thinking about how we might fund this, and whether there's an additional mill levy, or if it's, say, well, we've got enough incremental revenue from assessed values that we could ask the voters to dedicate it to this. I think we want to look at different options here, but I think we definitely want to look at it in the context of the rising assessed values and see how much of a difference that makes.
Okay, I would normally say, hey, does everybody agree with that? But maybe that's too simple. But do people agree with Aaron just said, generally speaking? Okay, so now we'll do addendums. Mary's next, so.
Agree.
Unless you just want to say you agree.
I have a question.
Okay.
To what extent does a broadband utility, or can a broadband utility leverage a municipal utility, electric utility? And where I'm going with that is, based on that, would it make sense to wait and see where the municipal electric utility is going?
Okay, if I answer.
Sure, if you have an answer.
In the memo, we make the statement that this would not, if it was a utility, it would not qualify as a Tabor utility. And because Tabor classifies it as an enterprise, it has to be an enterprise. And roughly, not the legal determination, but roughly, if you receive 90% of your your revenues from fees, then you can be a Tabor enterprise and issue revenue bonds without a vote. If, however, you violate that 10%, say it was a transfer from the general fund, or it was a property tax, or it was a sales tax, and you go over that 10%, you're not making it 90, then you're not going to be an enterprise fund, and every revenue bond issued would have to go to a vote. So now, where that is, if you want to join it with the electric utility, if we had been in existence like Loveland, Fort Collins, Longmont for decades, it would be much easier to do. But we're going to go out with electric municipal utility. It has to qualify as an enterprise fund under Tabor so that we can issue revenue bonds. If we would be now doing a full build out, that $100 to $140 million we talked of a little while ago, if you're trying to leverage that by including it with the electric utility, we've just now added $100 to $140 million of debt to that electric utility, and it may not qualify because electric utility, we could get 100% of the customers within the city limits. We're not going to get that with broadband. If you can get 35 to 40, you're feeling very good at the start. So those are the concerns. Longmont, definitely, it's a benefit to them. They could leverage it. They went to the voters. They said, can we include this broadband in our utility enterprise? Voters said yes. But they also didn't have a lot of debt with their electric utility. It's another type of leverage. It's debt leverage. How much do you have? So those are the things we're looking at. And any way that we've looked at it, if we build the utility ourselves, when you issue that amount of debt, you will not qualify as a Tabor enterprise because the expenses will be so great, the revenue would be too high. We need to have that. For a while, we'd have to have revenue from a property tax or a sales tax of some kind. We could give you much more information on it, but that's why we haven't been looking at that as an enterprise fund. And the other one is the time. Tom, you said earlier, we may not have a utility for X number of years, but we have to be playing with the same ground rules at that time.
Can I just add that I think that explanation would be very helpful to write down and disseminate because we're starting to hear that question. And I think it's a compelling idea that has a good response. Did you need to add anything? You're good. Okay, we have Sam and then Matt.
So I just wanted to ask about the Longmont comparison because I think that's what people here are very familiar with, obviously. They've had their utility since 1912, so for a much, much longer time. But their build-out costs, they estimate, if you believe what's on the website, for the Next Light program, at $40 million for all-in build-out costs. So I'm just curious, they're not quite as big as Boulder, but they're getting close, Longmont is. And so I was just curious if there are other advantages to the electric utility, like can they use the poles for two things? Are there other things we should be thinking about? I'd just like to understand better. When you do the explanation that Suzanne suggested, it would also, if there are other points of leverage that allowed them to come in at an estimate of 40 where we're looking at 100 to 140, I'd love to hear about that.
I just spent some time with folks in Longmont, and actually their 40 is now up to $56 million. So just for whatever it's worth, Carl can speak to some of the geology issues. And I think they kind of acknowledge there's some cross-subsidization between their electric utility and their fiber co. So I think there's a combination of factors. There's some geology. Carl can speak to that. There's some cross-subsidization. There certainly is the economies of scale of using the same billing platform, customer care, polls, and so on and so forth. So in other words, their costs of providing service is lower. Plus, I'm suspicious about whether 56 even is the all-in number because I think there's some subsidization going on there. But that's just my observation, having spent some time with them.
So if I could, I would just I'll say yes. Customer service, it's more advantageous because you're already providing that electric utility service. Pole access, rights-of-way access, generally advantageous. I think what you're hearing from a lot of people too is there's a philosophical alignment. I think what people are saying is, to the extent that we're considering a municipalization of electric utility and all the control that comes with it, it would be inconsistent to do anything less than that for broadband. That's probably what I've been hearing. So that's more of a philosophical argument, perhaps. The one other connection point between broadband and electric and having your own electric utility is, of course, the ability to have reliable, high-speed internet could certainly support the smart type of features that we'd want to add to any electrical grid. But it has more about, I mean, that's irrespective. In other words, that's just one of many examples that broadband could help. So broadband could help an electric utility, whether we own it or someone else. We would probably take more advantage of that for whatever demand side management type applications we'd want to add. But back to Councilmember Yates' point, I think that the dollar difference that you hear from Longmont is less because of their right of way, and more because of the fact that it's very expensive to dig in west of Broadway, especially because of all the hard rock that we have here.
Okay, wait a minute.
I just got one other that I wanted to put out there. Just a comment. Yeah, I think we should go forward and continue studying this. But my strong desire is that we really focus on how we're going to get the kinds of input that we want into both the operation and the architecture of the grid. So we've talked about two basic different ideas. One is where Boulder maybe owns some or all of the backbone of the network, and the other is where we own the drops. And I thought, from what I heard, that the drops was a pretty interesting way because easier to get to ubiquity, you touch the customer, and the private partner is doing the backhaul. And I think another point, if you do a summary for people to really understand, is that only 30 to 40% would be the adoption rate of what we expect for people to address service. So I would really like to be more clear as we get to July on what the pros and cons of the backbone versus the drops are and which we think would be most economical. So that'd be my request.
Matt?
All right, broadband east of Broadway. This solves the problem.
Jeez.
All right, so yes, but Sam asked just the right question. And then I got one comment on property taxes. But so the point of our having partial ownership, besides, it could be that whoever we do a deal with just insists that we have some partial ownership or partial investment. That's one possibility. And the other reason is to have partial ownership, as we've talked about before, pretty openly, is to preclude somebody from going off and something happened that we don't have any control over. So it gives us some amount of control. But Sam's question is exactly right. I've never been clear about this, is what is it that we might want to own partially? Both from a cost perspective, since that's one of the issues, but also from a control perspective. I am still nervous about, I know everybody loves owning the drops. I'm still nervous that in 5 years, those will be obsolete and they'll be replaced by a wireless system. And now you got all these wonderful drops that you paid for so that you can control things. And guess what? You control nothing, nothing whatsoever. Whereas the fundamental infrastructure, that isn't going to go away. You need the fundamental fiber backbone to make anything work. And so I don't know, but it seems to me that's a pretty important question, both from a cost and also from a, explaining to people why you might want to go do this. So that's part one. Part two, which we've been asked many times, is if we go this route, which is some partnership, does it in any way preclude us, should we ever get a muni, from deciding, well, now we got a muni, now we want to do something on our own, which could still be some sort of partnership, but it would clearly lean more towards the Boulder controlling it. And I mean, the only answer I've gotten, well, I'm not trying to knock the answer, is, well, legally we could, but I'd like a practical answer. Legally we might be able to, but if it would cost you a fortune to do it, it might not be practical in the end. So it'd be nice to have a little bit more understanding of that. And then there's one other thing. Well, in terms of the taxes, people have asked some really good questions. And Bob, I'm just going to totally make up some numbers now, but this is why you need to help us out. I mean, if the city gets, I don't know, if the general fund gets $25 million a year from property tax, and I'm kind of making that up, and if our property tax take goes up by about 20%, and I'm making that up too, but half of it's commercial, half of it's residential, and the commercial side's going to go up more than the residential side. The commercial people really get to eat this a lot more than the residential people do, big time, because of Gallagher. That could be $5 million a year. And the question is, as I think Mary asked, or somebody asked, well, could that kind of pay for this? And I think that's a fair question, or how much of it could it pay for? So, you'll know the numbers better once you see all the final results from the reassessments and the final number on Gallagher. But I think the state legislature decides that. So either they have already or they're going to by tomorrow, because they're done tomorrow. And that's a state legislative decision. So I think that number is actually known. And that's the number that we care about, is the Gallagher ratio. So I think, those are really good questions. It's not that we couldn't use it for other things, but this would certainly be something of great community interest that you could point to and say, yep, your taxes went up, but it's going to this really cool thing. And I just make one other quick comment, which is on waiting for a muni. Not like I don't want us to have a muni electric, as you know, but I think the timing is such that just makes no sense. I mean, if we made a deal with somebody this year, I'm assuming it's a year or two to build out. If you wait for the muni, that means it's 6 to 8+ years for build out. And I don't think people want to wait. I don't want to wait 6 to 8 years. That's crazy in this world. I mean, we're living with second world broadband, and I don't think we want second world broadband for another 6 to 8 years. So it's something we really need to do something about, and then see if it is precluding us in some way if we ever wanted to switch. And if it is, well, so what do we do about that? It's all perfectly good questions. And I think even though the tax part of this is easy, I think those questions need to be answered for voters to comfortably vote on it.
Okay, that was going to be my point, is I think all the questions we've been asking and the write-ups we asked you to do are going to be essential to the public conversation, as people just started waking up to thinking about this, and that'll be part of the discussion. But the short answer is still yes. Okay, we have Aaron and then Mary, and then hopefully we're done.
Yeah, well, first of all, just totally agree with Matt on the timing question. So, yes. Just one point I wanted to raise that I don't remember us talking about before, that I want us to bring into the negotiations, which is about privacy policies. Because, in the last couple of months, Congress overturned the law that prevented ISPs from selling your browser history. Right. I think we want to make sure that we strike a deal that does not allow a broadband utility to sell people's private information about their browsing history. So I'd like that to get that into the negotiations, as at least hear their thoughts on that.
So for me, it's okay to continue on the path that we've been on, but I did want to point out what Carl brought up with the fact that it's philosophically inconsistent, that we're trying to create a municipal utility to get out from under the clause of corporate control, and here we are putting ourselves under corporate control in another arena. So just wanted to point that out.
Well, and I actually think that gets at the question, presumably, if we're going to do this, and this is a question we kept answering again and again when you said, are we okay with not doing the full build out, is yes, if we retain control. And that's the kicker. And so that's, I think, the premise of this whole thing is, can we control enough of what we need to control our fate, but not have to pay for the whole thing? And that is the crux. So if we can't do that, then we are failing to accomplish what we want.
And are we precluding future options? That's
Right.
the other difference.
Yeah.
Those
So-
are the two really key things.
Right, and those are the crux issues, I think, as we go forward.
I mean, I think it's more about the goals in a way than, the goal for me isn't corporation or not corporation. It's actually getting to ubiquity. It's getting to high speed. It's getting to low price. It's getting to, all of that. Control is just a way of us exerting influence to get there. And I think if we've heard a bunch of different interesting ideas from staff about how we might get to having a first right of refusal, for example, right? That's not direct control, but it's you being first in line if they want to do something that you've agreed up front is not part of your package of goals. So I think we have to be very careful about getting there. I agree with that completely, but I think we should focus on the outcomes that we're after, not who the partner is per se.
If I could also, another distinguishing, or I guess a counter argument to that philosophical argument would be, in the electric utility, we have a monopoly, and so it's a very different situation. Here, we're looking to break a duopoly and add more competition. So it's fundamentally different in that if we were looking to identify one partner to take care of all our broadband needs, then I think it would be similar to the electric utility, but it's not. We're looking to do just the opposite. We're trying to find more competition.
And Carl, maybe you could speak, so adding the next ISP takes us from 2 providers to 3 providers, but maybe you could say a few words also about open access, which might provide a 4th and a 5th and a 6th provider.
Sure. Just a reminder that a minimum goal would be to bring a 3rd provider. So in addition to CenturyLink and Comcast, we'd have, let's say it's Ting. With open access, Ting would also be providing their network that they finance or that they jointly finance with the city and making it available to several other internet service providers. So the scenario would be you have a choice as a consumer or as a business, a person who owns a business, to go with CenturyLink, Comcast, Ting, or internet service provider 1 through 10. That's very much theoretical at this point because we don't have any examples to point to other cities that have been successful at open access. That's why I called it the Holy Grail, where I think everybody agrees that only with competition do you have a sure bet that you'll have the best customer service, the lowest prices, and so on. That is what we're aiming for. So when we listed the goals, that's one of the goals that we've aimed with. And to the extent that we can't get anything close to open access, that's going to make a finalist much less attractive to us.
Okay. I think it's important. You're going to have to remind people of these things. So we good? Okay.
One more topic. The Charter Committee referrals, there are 3 that I'd like to describe very briefly and get your feedback on. The first one is cleaning up obsolete matters in the Charter. The Charter Committee has identified 13 areas where they recommend cleaning up some of the issues in the Charter. They range from some ones that have caused us trouble in the recent past. We have Charter provisions that have time deadlines for things like election filings and petition filings that aren't the same as state law. And so the recommendation would be we take the dates out of the Charter so you can either do it by ordinance so that you can change them as state law changes, or you just let it default to state law. As you know, we've had some protests in the last couple of years where it wasn't clear which set of rules applied, and we had some confusion about which set of rules applied. So there's things like that the Charter Committee would like you to consider putting on the ballot. And as I said, there's 13 of them. There are also some that just should be taken out. For example, there's a provision in the Charter that provides for who serves as Director of Finance when the Charter was adopted in 1918. No longer necessary because the Charter has now been in effect for a very long time. So there's also a requirement that the city manager post a bond, which is kind of archaic. It's not really done, and the city usually posts it anyway. So there are a bunch of things like that. So the question is, do you want to go forward with those? The second one is the Charter Committee had recommended adding 4 more commissions to the Charter. It's not really clear exactly why. As you know, we have, I believe, 22 boards and commissions. We have 4 in the Charter now. We have the Planning Board, the Open Space Board of Trustees, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, and the Arts Commission. There are specific reasons for each one of those. Didn't I say, what did I say? Arts, I'm sorry, Library Commission. Both the Library Commission and Parks get a little bit of funds, so they get that. So the other ones all have some special duties that they're in the Charter so that the council can't take them away. So the Planning Board obviously has authority over the 4-body review. They also have authority over changes to Title IX. The Parks and Rec Advisory Board and the Open Space Board of Trustees have a veto power over disposals of property in their relative areas authority. The Library Commission used to actually have authority to run the library. That was changed 2 years ago, but they still get a small mill levy so that they get to administer. So there's reasons, it's not clear why you'd want to add additional ones. Adding additional ones makes it harder for council to change in the future. So one of the reasons that the planning board and parks are in there is that they have different numbers of members than are required by the charter. The charter says that all commissions shall have 5 members. Planning board and parks have 7, and those were as a result of charter changes. So those are changes you can make, but the committee recommended adding more boards and commissions to the charter. And then the last one has to do with the People's Ordinance. We have a People's Ordinance on campaign finance. The feeling of the Charter Commission was that it does not go far enough in requiring disclosures, particularly in the area of corporate disclosures. So they wanted staff to explore ways to expand the authority to require disclosures of campaign contributions from corporations to the extent that it would be consistent with the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. So the recommendation would be, since it's not a charter provision, it's a People's Ordinance, and as a People's Ordinance, it should be changed by the people. That's my presentation.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
When we met with Youth Opportunity Advisory Board, they indicated that they were going to try to bring forward a charter amendment as well as far as youth voting at 16 and 17 in citywide elections. I guess I'm asking this of the Charter Committee. Have you heard where they're at on that and whether they might? This is the Youth Opportunity Advisory Board. Our board has been working for a couple of years on a proposed charter amendment which would allow people at the age of 16 and 17 to vote in city elections. And apparently that's
like they mentioned to us, right?
Yeah, and apparently that's allowed if the people put that in the charter. I'm not asking your opinion on that, Tom. I'm just telling you what they said. So I guess I'm asking the Charter Committee whether you've heard about that and whether that's something that might come to us.
They haven't brought anything forward to us that I'm aware of. So I didn't make it to the UAB dinner, so you may have heard more from them about where they are on that than we have. But they haven't made a request of us.
Aren't we doing something with Joab shortly? Thursday, okay. Okay, well, can we just go through these one by one? I think we have, and do questions as we go. On number 1, does anybody care if we clean up the charter?
You'll find these to be helpful. I think there's a lot of minutia. It's got a lot to do with voting deadlines, and in every way, I think we make it more liberal for the clerk to be able to get her responses lined up. So is that right, Tom? Is that a fair way of saying that?
Yes. And there are some that are almost necessary. For example, our scheduling of election actually conflicts with state and federal laws some years. So we'd want to fix that.
So
could this be one ballot issue?
Yes.
You all glom together?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so that sounds good. Okay.
That's fine.
On the second one, can somebody on the Charter Committee explain a little bit more, like which committees and why, like EAB I saw on there, why EAB?
Go ahead. Well, I mean, we've been hearing some feedback. I think the Boards and Commissions Committee has passed along, and we've heard directly from, just as individual council people, about some frustration that certain of the board members have and some of the boards that exist right now. And there's some thought that, they're seen as strictly advisory. They don't have any of these kinds of oversight duties that Tom named for the ones that are in the Charter Committee. So it's just something that I think we wanted to talk with council about and see would a possible path to making them feel more empowered and actually giving them a little bit higher responsibilities be to have them be in the charter. There was the question, say, with the Transportation Advisory Board, which we would, I guess, rename the Mobility Board, of being able to interface more tightly with planning. We've heard a lot about that, and so trying to create that in the charter. There's nothing that says we couldn't do this legislatively, but there was also that point that if they get voted in by the people, they're more likely to have more durability over time, just because I think council would be less inclined to mess around with the definitions or the numbers or anything. So I think that was pretty much the full thinking.
So one thing that I did want to add in terms of the Transportation Advisory Board, the TAB, is that there's a real nexus between planning and transportation, and our governance doesn't tend to reflect that as well as it could. And so with some sort of authority given by being in the charter, it could be expressed better that way.
One final thing is, we've talked about a housing board in the past on council, and a thought with the housing board specifically is taking that to the people to see if they want to vote on that board's existence and essentially a reason for existence of it. It seemed like maybe when you're creating a new one, you should hear from the people.
Matt?
All right, it won't surprise you. I don't like this idea. I have been trying to get a ballot issue on for 30 years to allow us to have more than 5 people on the boards, but I've never succeeded. But this one, yeah, the only reason for having boards in the charter are if they have either some funding source, and frankly, some of the funding sources are pretty out of date right now. You know, Parks gets a little bit of mill levy and library does, but they get such a massive amount more from the general fund that the mill levy is kind of ancient history. And we wouldn't do it that way now. It probably made sense in 1950, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense now. Or they have a special power. In other words, they're not just purely advisory. But those are really limited. I mean, with the exception of the planning board, which is its own magical special case, open space and parks have only one special power, and that's disposal of land. Everything else they're advisory on. And that's it. And library has really no special power anymore. So I just can't imagine why you'd give, I don't even know what it is you'd give to these boards. And whatever you gave them, it would be really hard to change it later if you got it wrong. It could be too much or it could be too little, frankly. Could be either way, and you wouldn't really know. I mean, I think they are advisory boards. And I love the boards. I've served on boards. I think they're fabulous, but they should be advisory. And I mean, EAB's purview is pretty hand-wavy, and that's okay, actually. But I just don't know what it is you would say. What, you have transportation board has veto power over what? I've thought about this. I just don't know what it would be that you'd give them veto power over. Everything else can be done legislatively, easily. If we want somebody on transportation board to be ex officio, well, the other way around, probably somebody on planning board to be ex officio on transportation board, we can do that. Absolutely nothing stops us.
Just for what it's worth, we weren't proposing any special powers for any of the boards.
Well, then there's just no point in putting it in the charter. I mean, if you worry that, and I just frankly don't have this worry. I know some council members do about, oh my God, some rogue council is going to do away with EAB someday. Boy, that's the least of your worries. I just wouldn't fixate on that particular problem.
But
They're advisory.
Well, so to build on this, though, the idea that we might want to go through a process of legislatively clarifying for boards their roles and some of the cross-fertilization, or however you want to refer to it, that might be useful. And I would certainly, you would have to go through a process anyhow, even if you were going to do a charter. So it seems to me that we could accomplish the intent, which is to clarify, because I served on EAB. It was very frustrating because you kind of wondered, what is our role here? And you really had to scream loud in order to be heard and feel relevant. And so anyhow, I think we could accomplish that legislatively, and we would need to do so anyhow to go through that thought process.
They're all in the code. And I'm not saying their definitions are great. Believe me, I'm not suggesting that the councils that invented these boards got it right the first time. In fact, I agree with you, Suzanne. Now that the boards have been running for a while, it's very much worth a look at, have some of the roles changed a little bit? Has their purview maybe gotten bigger, gotten smaller? Did we just get it wrong? Did some new things come along? When EAB was created, maybe some things didn't even exist back then that now they should be looking at. Well, that's fine. You can change it in the code. And you know what? The other way you change things, I'm sorry, this is much simpler, is you direct the city manager to basically, have boards work with each other, have departments work with each other. You don't have to certainly go to the extreme of a charter change. So I do think it's worth looking at again, absolutely, for some of the boards, big time, because some of them were a little bit squishy when they were created. But
Not the charter.
with years of experience, I think we can fix up some of the squishiness.
So other thoughts on this? Is there interest in maybe doing a code review, or maybe even getting input from the committees about, they looked at their charters and gave input to us on that? Yes? Are you trying to, anyhow, you guys are doing this.
I was just agreeing with
Okay.
the things that the two of you said. Great.
Okay. And Jan?
I agree too. And one of the things we talked about at the retreat too was that some of the boards, I think, would like to have the ear of the council a bit more. And maybe that was on me. I don't remember. We were going to come up with some sort of an idea about how council might have responsibility for visiting a board once every 6 months or something like that. And I think that would enable them to feel like they're being heard on a more regular basis than just Matt and I going out once a year. So if that was my action, then I am very willing to write up a suggestion and take it to Matt, and we'll talk about it and then come forward with something.
Okay. And it sounds like a little bit of a review of, the code and what's written up. Okay, so is that good enough for people?
I thought the idea of, if we do review the code, to put it on the agenda of the boards and have them discuss it over a period of time to come up with some concrete suggestions of what we could do, and then we put it on the work plan, and it might be a good thing to start the process of now. And
Okay, so the boards and commissions committee will come back to us? Does that work for everybody that was on the charter committee?
Yeah, this was mostly an attempt to elevate that in visibility and to at least have a concrete proposal to put out there. And we picked the boards we did because we felt like they were the ones that had the most to gain from something like that. So there you go.
Okay, so you'll come back to us with a suggestion that will also involve the boards and commissions in this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly our fault, I guess. We start down this road and then we get sidetracked and we don't go pick it up again. I'll take part of the blame for that, believe me. But I think we've got time to do one more round of outreach to the boards. I mean, it takes us 3 months to get to them all, but we've got time to do that, and we should do it one more time.
Okay, excellent. And then on the last one, the proposed changes to people's ordinances, right?
I'll try and represent Lisa on this. I mean, she was particularly, there are some entities that can donate that don't have the same disclosure requirements that individuals do to council candidates. And so I think there was a significant concern on Lisa's part that we try and learn more about where that money is coming from. So I'll just represent it there. I feel like, we got some creative ideas from the city attorney's office because we're seriously limited by Citizens United. And I would personally like to hear more about this because this is all more about transparency, basically. And it's all more about figuring out what the motivations are behind the people who give to candidates. And I believe Lisa also wanted to try and extend that even more to ordinances, right? Because or charter changes, ordinances, to what extent can we get more transparency behind entities that contribute to that? So she wanted to raise this. It was a really big issue with her. I think it's worthy of discussion because Kathy gave us some ideas that I thought were worth thinking about. And so I would just say I'd like to pursue it more to learn more about what our options are, but it's not to say that we're at the point where I know if I can support something going forward.
Corporations are people too.
I'll just say that more transparency about campaign contributions is a good thing, I think. So let's explore it.
I'm fine with exploring it. Is anybody not?
Me too. I mean, really, honestly, for us, exploring it to me means having our legal staff tell us how far you can go under the current rules. But I'm happy to push as far as we can go.
Okay. All right, so that's a yes.
Okay.
And then I guess,
Tom, do you have any comments on that, by the way?
No, I agree. I think it'll be interesting to look at, and we'll come back with some options.
Great, thanks.
okay, is there anything else that people wanted to consider for the ballot? I do know that, well, we may or may not have anything on statewide transportation funding. Maybe we have a deal.
The legislature might have a deal, but the independent private group might still put something,
Right.
they might petition something on. I don't think any of us have a good sense yet of how many state ballot issues there will be, although it doesn't feel like there's going to be a boatload like there was last time,
Doesn't seem.
which is nice. I don't know.
On the county level, we're likely to see worthy cause, and they're considering adding yet another term to the sheriffs
Oh,
because people like Pelly.
every year we add.
Yeah.
See, there should be an easier way to do that, but
But those are the only two I know of.
is the school district doing anything, or do we know? I have no. Okay.
They know.
All right. Well, that's good. That sounds like a lighter year than last time.
Okay. Anything? Oh, next steps. Shall we read? What does it say?
So we've got the municipalization study session July 11th, the renewal of the tax July 25th, broadband July 25th, and the charter committee items we brought forward at the council meetings. We don't have those scheduled yet. And then, of course, I promised to do some work on the one municipalization issue, the 178 issue, and bring that back on the 11th as well.
Which one?
The one, section 178 changes.
Oh.
where council was sort of split evenly.
Oh, right,
Try to
concepts.
and try to give it more substance so you can get better direction.
Okay, sound good? Okay, adjourned.